Thank you for the kind introduction. Thank you for the invitation to speak at this wonderful conference. And it's also a conference that is appropriate for the time, I think, and it's also, I wanted to show something that is not something of the past, because there is news yesterday, purification right in St. Peter's after a naked man desecrated the Pope's altar. So this is still important. I didn't have time to put it on the next slide. It is in the news. If you're okay. They did it on purpose. Okay. Almost 10 years ago, an interesting conference was organized to challenge the master narrative in medieval canon law. Central notions in this master narrative were the rise of centralized papal government, the emergence of the university, the development of new legal hermeneutics, and with the Decretum Gratiani around 1140, the compilation of a law book that was to remain in use for centuries. The revolutionary changes that were taking place in canon law in the 12th century were central in the story of transformation and often implicit progress. Changes that were labeled as the Renaissance of the 12th century, the rise of the papal monarchy, scholastic humanism, or more negatively, the formation of a persecuting society. In the long run, this was still a way to write the medieval period into an even larger narrative about the rise of the modern world or the rise of the West, thus responding to the gauntlet thrown by Jacob Burckhardt and his Culture der Renaissance in Italy. The master narrative of medieval canon law. This is the book that came out of the conference I just left. The master narrative of medieval canon law has mostly been composed by two French scholars, Paul Fournier and Gabriel Lebras, with their Histoire des collections canoniques en Occident depuis les fonds décrétales jusqu'au décret de Gratien. That was published in 1931 and 1932 in 2 volumes. The 2 volumes were the result of a lifelong study of pre-Gratian canonical collections by Paul Fournier, then the Dean of Medieval Legal Studies in France, if not worldwide. Over 50 years, Fournier had investigated an enormous amount of canonical material, and his analyses of canonical collections, penitential books, and an impressive number of manuscripts containing such material are still often very worth their while, although in some cases, these results are no longer accepted. Fournier and Lebras clearly thought in terms of a uniform Western church under papal leadership, governed by a systematic body of law. And any work that did not conform to such a view was seen as dangerous and contagious, leading to chaos and anarchy. In the late antique period, everything was put in proper order. The church was ordered in a perfect hierarchy, provided with precise, abundant laws. Such is the result of the organizing activity which took place throughout Christendom at the very time when the disintegration of the empire was being prepared. It is clear that for them, the church was a well-organized hierarchical body with the bishops of Rome at its head. Yet after the demise of the Roman Empire, the scribes, as they say, they evidently avoided to use terms such as scholars or canonists. The scribes of these barbarian centuries perverted this hierarchical order into chaos. The main perpetrators leading to this chaos were wayward Irish monks. In contrast to the unified church of late antiquity, Celtic Christianity, with no territorial hierarchy to uphold the law everywhere, preferred its arbitrary penitentials. That's also a citation. These collections of judgments related to the introduction of private penance in the Western world were not promulgated by any ecclesiastical councils, but were the results of private persons providing guidelines as how to judge sinners, and that is what kinds of penance to assign for particular sins. Merovingian Church, this is especially for Yitzhak, was the nadir for the church and its laws, tainted as it was by mediocre collectors and the profound influence of insular penitentials. It was with the early Carolingians that things changed for the better. La Grande Collection Romaine, that is the collections put together by Dionysius Exiguus and sent to Charlemagne, and the Collectia Hispana successfully opposed the local Merovingian collections and the penitentials without any authority. They provided a well-ordered series of law that would triumph thanks to the reforms engendered by the Carolingian dynasty. It may be clear that for Fournier and Lebras, order, hierarchy, and Rome were key concepts in their view of canon law. And these were opposed to chaos, arbitrariness, and Celtic Christianity, with its perfidious penitential books that were characterized as contagious outside influences. The fact that these handbooks for confessors often contained graphic, detailed descriptions of sexual behavior that was considered as sinful might have contributed to the negative responses. To the negative responses to these works from Fournier and Lebras, as the inclusion of specific rules that did not conform to their idea of what Christian religion should look like, such as dietary taboos that we often encounter in these texts. So these were things like this, I think, were for them filthy and therefore hardly acceptable as proper canon law. Moreover, the lack of a proper organization of the material, a certain inconsistency in prescribing penances, duplications of judgments, was not to the taste of these well-trained legal scholars. From this perspective, it becomes clear why Fournier opposed the thesis put forward by Hermann Josef Schmitz that penitential books found their origin in Rome, and that Schmitz had been able to identify a Roman penitential book as a founder of penitential traditions. Scholars have followed Fournier in his detailed analysis of the penitential that Schmitz had claimed to be of Roman origin, thus demonstrating that they all built on, and that it built on earlier insular and Frankish texts. And he was certainly correct in doing so, but the condescending tone with which he and Lebras wrote about early medieval canonical collections and penitential books also had implications for the study of these texts that need to be redressed, I think. Early medieval canonical collections have not yet received the attention that they deserve. Reading the work of Gregory of Tours is certainly a rewarding undertaking, but it seems hardly defensible that the International Medieval Bibliography comes up with 115 hits when I search with the title word Gregory of Tours, and only 8 for the title word Vetus Gallica, which is an important collection of the same time. Einhard, the author of the Vita Caroלי, gives us 53 hits. The Collectio Dacheriana, arguably the most influential canonical collection of the Carolingian age, adds up to only 3 references. Looking for the keyword penitentials results in a meager 166 hits. A geography, yeah, 20,003. Historiography, 28,562. Of course, Fournier and Lebras' condescending views on early medieval canonical collections and handbooks for confessors are not the only reason for this lack of scholarly attention, but the master narrative that they formulated is certainly an important factor leading to such results. One of the results of the master narrative was to see penitential texts as not truly belonging to canon law proper. Now the question is, of course, who is deciding what belongs to canon law proper and what not? Scholars have tended to follow Fournier and Lebras in this. And though they realized that penitential books sometimes interfered with canon law, interfered between brackets, they regard penitential rules as intruders or fremdkörper in canon law collections and in manuscripts. If we look at medieval readers, however, the situation becomes less clear. Carolingian sources often stated that priests and bishops should know the canons. And in Charlemagne's famous programmatic capitulary, the Admonitio Generalis, issued in 789, chapter 55, do I have it here? Reads to bishops and priests from the same that no one of the priests is allowed to ignore the statutes of the holy canons. And this is adopted from a letter of Pope Celestine I, not Innocent I, as the Admonitio implies, to the bishops of Apulia and Calabria from the year 429, and it entered Charlemagne's admonition through the Collectio Dionisio Hadriani. This decretal letter was already widely known, but Carolingian admonition gave it a further boost as a survey of episcopal capitularies shows. I have here a few where you find what the bishops contain. Bishop capitularies contain the same kind of text. No priest should ignore the canons. And as you see, Bishop Theodosius of Oria even went so far as to demand that priests not only own a copy of the canons, but should also know them by heart. And although medieval memories were sometimes a lot better trained than our modern ones, this seems a rather strict requirement. We are not sure what exactly the authors formulating such commands had in mind when they wrote about the canons. Perhaps Charlemagne and his advisors, when issuing the Admonitio Generalis, had the Collectio Dionisio Hadriana in mind, because they included a large part of that collection into the capitulary. But was this also what other authors had in mind? There were many collections containing canonical material circulating in the Carolingian world of different sizes and containing a wide variety of material. Were people thinking of particular collections, or did they have a more general notion in mind? An answer can be found in an episcopal statute that was probably composed somewhere in northern France in the first decades of the 9th century, that belongs to the first generation of these texts. This text, known as the Capitula Parisiensia, opens with the question, what is a canon and what does the canon contain? We can see it here. The answer given to this question is quite detailed. In dealing with this issue, the author draws heavily upon the etymology of Isidore of Seville, but does not follow him slavishly. From Isidore, he adopts the translation of the Greek word canon to Latin regula, a ruler, because it leads straight and there's no rectitude without it. And still partly paraphrasing Isidore, the author explains that canons found their origin in the Council of Nicaea at the time of Emperor Constantine, a council that met to refute the views of Arius, who denied that the Son was co-eternal with the Father. And then the councils of Constantinople, Ephesus, Chalcedon are mentioned with a principled dogmatic decision. And the text includes the number of bishops present on these occasions. After thus explaining what a canon is, the author continues with the discussion of how to understand the canon. The canon means living properly, to act accordingly, to keep to the right faith, to acknowledge the divinity and humanity of our Lord Jesus Christ, and to suppress the perversities of the heretics and hold on to the teachings of the Orthodox fathers. In short, the text still says, the canon teaches how to live a just life and how to correct those who deviate from the right path. It is the law of laws that is preeminent above all laws of human production. Now, what seems important to the author of this text is, first of all, orthodoxy in relation to a proper understanding of the Trinity. And it is only at the end that the author addresses two aspects that we would regard as central for ecclesiastical legislation: the setting of norms and the correction of those that transgress them. When Charlemagne issued the Admonitio Generalis, he might not have intended that all priests knew the Collectio Dionisio Hadriana and were able to use it in a legal setting. He might merely have meant that they should know the basic elements of Christian history as found in the canonical collection, that they would know about the major heresies and would realize that emperors and the papacy were the guardians of the proper Christian faith. They should also understand the basic rules of Christian life, live accordingly, and transmit these rules to the laity in their charge. Another way to look into the question what it might have been meant by the canons is to look at the manuscript contents of codices dealing with such issues. I take as an example a manuscript now preserved in Troyes, manuscript in 1979. A small manuscript measuring 10 to 14 centimeters, which contains a great variety of texts. It dates from the 10th or 11th century, but the text it contains were all in existence by the 9th century. And Susan Keefe came up with a plausible suggestion that we are dealing with a faithful copy of a Carolingian manuscript. And there are more of such miscellaneous manuscripts that still require detailed study. This manuscript contains in essence material on the Creed, the canon law collection known as the collection 234 chapters, the collection briefly described by Fournier and Lebrun, but that still awaits a study in depth and an edition. And following upon this collection, we find 3 penitential books, one composed by Haletka of Cambrai at the request of P. Boisbriand, a penitential known as Pseudo Theodore, and the third one, the Penitentiale Tricense. In this penitential part, related material is included as well. A letter of Rabanus Maurus discussing, among others, how to deal with a man who has beaten up his pregnant wife so badly that she lost 3 children, and only one of them could be baptized in time. We find also texts already discussed here this morning, the Responsiones 7 and 8 of the Libellus Responsiorum of Gregory the Great, dealing with postpartum impurity and with nocturnal pollution of a priest. And if you look at the manuscript, there is no indication that these texts were regarded as being of a different nature than the others. And as a whole, I think this ensemble of texts lives up to the expectations raised by the Capituli Parisiensia, what the canon should be. One can say that the manuscript contains a kind of compendium of basic Christian knowledge concerning the major tenets of Christian belief, ecclesiastical discipline, and the correction of sinners. And as such, it seems to conform to what the Capitula Parisiensia defines as the canons. Manuscripts such as this one from Troyes are only seldom discussed, let alone analyzed as a whole. And I would conclude that the manuscript as a whole is what Carolingian authors could regard or would regard as the canon, with all the variety of text, duplications, and contradictions that it contains. Yet, following the lead of Fournier and Lebrun, historians of canon law have been reluctant to regard such a miscellaneous collection as canon law. I am certain that many compilers of early medieval manuscripts were less strict in deciding what belongs to the canon and what is not than modern scholars, and we would do well to take that into account. There are, however, some indications that Fournier and Lebrun's views were shared in the Carolingian period, and this is what I now want to turn to. It has been stated that Carolingian rulers were occupied with correctness, authority, and orthodoxy. Charlemagne was clearly interested in the authority of orthodox canons, and as we have seen, supported knowledge of these rules. Rome, for him, just as for Fournier and Lebrun, was the font of orthodoxy. The fact that he requested a number of central texts for organizing the Frankish Church from Rome demonstrates the importance of that place for Charlemagne and his advisors. The fundamental and programmatical capitulary issued in 789, that we already discussed, Admonitio Generalis, was based on the Collectio Dionisio Hadriana a canonical collection with a Roman stamp sent to Charlemagne in 774. The Admonitio contains 59 chapters taken directly from this canonical collection and thus reveals the importance of an authoritative Roman collection of canons for Charlemagne and his advisors. The Carolingian Reform Councils that convened in 813 also reveal that some participants worried about the correct body of rules that were to be followed by the clergy and the laity. These councils were the product of a conscious effort on the part of the aging Charlemagne and his advisors to address serious problems within the church and the realm. It is revealing, though, that bishops convened in 5 different places: Arles, Reims, Mainz, Châlons-en-Champagne, and Tours. And although there is a general agenda behind all these meetings, probably resulting from an imperial decree, the councils come to different conclusions, and these differences were, as far as we know, never resolved into a general unified policy. When I looked into the decrees dealing with penance, the main conclusion was that there were clear signs of concern with the use of the proper procedures and the proper texts, but that the 5 councils did not agree about a uniform way to deal with sins, confession, and penance. It is telling that the Council of Tours decreed that because some priests assigned various and inconsiderate penances, it was necessary to confer with all bishops at the Sacred Palace to decide which penitential book was to be used. Such a meeting probably never took place, nor was there any general agreement on the main authority to adhere to when it came to hearing confession and assigning the proper kind of penance. Whereas the issue of which penitential book to follow was not addressed at Arles or Mainz, the Council of Châlons was the most outspoken critic of such text. The bishops assembled on the Marne decreed that the measure of penance was to be decided on the basis of the teaching of the ancient canons, or on the authority of Holy Scripture, or according to ecclesiastical custom, but that those little books that are penitentials, of which the errors are as certain as its authors are uncertain, are to be repudiated and totally eliminated. The vehemence of the decree is enhanced further by its quotations from the book of Ezekiel concerning false prophets who make pillows for the heads of persons of every age to catch souls, and who kill souls which should not die, and save souls alive which should not live. The concern was that such confessors assigned penances for grave offenses that were too light or too unusual, inusitatos. The Council of Paris in 829, a year of great political tension in the reign of Louis the Pious, quoted even more amply from the book of Ezekiel on the topic of false prophets, when it again condemned the use of penitential books. It also went further than the Council of Châlons, when it required bishops to diligently scrutinize their dioceses to gather these defective penitential books and to set them alight, in order to take care that inexperienced priests would no longer deceive people. Michael de Jong and Courtney Booker have both emphasized the state of frenzy at the highest political levels in which this council took place. Now, historians in the past have often regarded these conciliar statements as resulting from a unified Carolingian policy regarding canon law, and that this policy aimed at removing penitential books from the canon law. Fournier and Lebrun clearly were of such an opinion, and they adopted the perspective of some of the Carolingian clerics participating in these programmatic councils, as if this were the general policy of the time. Since a number of decades, we are moving away from this master narrative, as Jennifer Davis has demonstrated with regard to Carolingian government, and in particular to Charlemagne's reign. She has argued forcefully that Charlemagne and the court pursued major aims, following a set of guiding ideas, structured by a series of persistent concerns, consistent patterns of political response, and an ability to respond fruitfully to new circumstances. But she also stresses the variable implementation of these consistent ideas. Contingency was as important as consistency. And this agrees with the way in which Carolingian bishops dealt with sins and their penances. Now I come to my conclusion. Following this approach, I think we should no longer simply regard canon law in the Carolingian period as a systematic body of law contributing to a uniform Western Church under papal leadership, as Fournier and Lebras had done. We should keep our eyes open for the richness and the great diversity that our sources reveal and take these seriously, not discard them as being the result of mediocre collectors or pernicious non-Roman influences. There were many parties in this world with different ideas, different concepts, different ideals about what belonged to the authoritative past that legitimized the present and that was used to formulate guidelines for the future. Rosalind McKittrick once suggested that canon law collections need not have had a function in ecclesiastical courts, but that they may have been meant as a kind of history book, giving an overview of the origins of the Christian faith, the major councils, the chief heresies, and highlighting the central role of bishops and emperors. And I think that some canonical collections served such a task, that the authoritative past was used to legitimize the present or to prop up a certain policy. But most of all, we should admit that canon law before Gratian was not regarded as a coherent legal system. Collections of written law were not seen as an embodiment of the law, but merely as a description and discussion of the way the law looks like. The law itself remained an abstract notion, similar to notions of justice or righteousness. To regard some canons as improper, or the terminology chosen by the bishops in Paris in 829, and adopted by Fournier and Lebras as impure, does not tell us how the majority of the readers of canon law manuscripts saw these rules, let alone how they were put into practice. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Rob. This is great. I have two questions, one sort of tiny, narrow, and then one a bigger one. I was thinking particularly when you put up the admonitios, the first passage about the Instituta. And I'm wondering a little bit about the vocabulary Carolingian sources use to refer to canon law. So Instituta, I was really struck there in the context in which you were giving us, I think, spoke beautifully to that kind of narrative that you're trying to draw of a broader understanding. But, you know, you can use a range of other different words. Sometimes it's just the sacred canon, sometimes it's the decrees or decretals, etc. So I was curious if you've seen patterns in vocabulary in Carolingian authors being specific or not, perhaps, in what terms they actually use to identify canons. So that's sort of the philology question.
Yeah.
And then my broader question is, I really appreciated the sketch that you gave us of understanding canon law is not codified and is much broader and more flexible and usable and etc. So I'm wondering though then if, and you know, obviously did this great deconstruction of Fournier and Lebras, what would be your narrative though? Because, you know, along with this, the flexibility in the manuscripts, this is a moment too where there are ways in which some things are codified, some of the new collections that are produced, like the Jeriana, etc. And so where do you sort of, how would you redo the narrative if it's going to be the Rob narrative rather than the Fournier and Lebras?
Okay, thank you for two very difficult questions. First one, I did not really go into yet, so that's something I have to do. That there is certainly a great variety of terms that people use, and the Institute also struck me. I think there's also some kind of educational aspect to it there. I think, and I'd like to hear your thoughts about that. the second one, I think what I would like to stress, I'm not sure whether I'm following this up, but if I do, and I have some plans to do that. I think the variety, debate and discussion would be a very important aspect of what the canons mean at that. So this is not one reading of certain texts, but there are very different positions. These people define what for them the canon is in different ways. They accept, some people accept other texts than other people do. And we would have to go through the collections of the period as Van Meter does at the moment, to see what they really thought was important for what that canon is. And I think I would also like to look more into the manuscripts and see how these texts are combined in manuscripts, and whether the texts that we find the most important one were actually regarded as the most important one at the time, and I have sincere doubts about that. So I think there will not be one uniform story, but I think debate, variety, dissent, that would be major themes.
Very much. It was very interesting, and I had many questions written down. I won't ask it now. For the interest of all of us.
I'm here for 2 more days.
Ask if that's all right. And the first is, surely the thing that bothered some Carolingian authors about these penitentials are not the same matters that bothered the modern French historians about something. So, or are they? So I did not quite understand why they're sometimes condemned. And the second question I have is, how do you think this non-systematic approach to canon law is related to other systems or non-systems of law in Carolingian law? Like, maybe it's
I'm a bit tired. So the first one, whether Fournier-Lebrun's view coincided with Carolingian criticism or not, I think partly it does. I think for these Carolingian bishops, proper authority, as Fournier and Lebrun would also see it, either accepted conciliar legislation or a papal stamp, if I may put it that way. That's what the Carolingian bishops thought was important. That's also what Fournier and Lebrun find important. There's another correspondence in that these bishops also have a problem with discrepancy. So if there's different measures of penance assigned for the same sin, especially with bestiality, that is addressed. So having sex with an animal in the Council of Nicaea, that's a minimum of 12 years of penance. In the penitential of Cumin, it's only 1 year, and that was for them a kind of a problem. So, and that would also be a problem for Fournier and Lebrun, I think. I'm not. I think there's another correspondence, and that is the fact that these texts have no authority, that they have no name. They're anonymous texts. An anonymous text for these Carolingian bishops in this setting were a problem. At least anonymity is one of the accusations that there is against them. I'm not sure whether they would find all anonymous texts problematic, but the fact that these are anonymous is for them a problem. And I think in modern research, we still have a problem. If the text is anonymous, it's less interesting than the case that we have. And that's also, so that's hopefully some kind of answer to your first question. The second question, I think that's a great problem that we haven't solved yet. How does such a system work? With sexual legislation, people have argued lately quite a bit that these legal texts, secular legal texts that we have play some role in the legal system, but if you look at practice, you see that in specific cases, nobody looks at what is written down and then tries to apply that to this specific case. So that is a general, and I think that might be very similar to what I see happening with canon law in this period. So what is written down is not necessarily applied in that way, the way we would do nowadays, but it's more a suggestion to start thinking about the problem along lines as laid down in this. How that would work out in practice is something that I think still needs a lot of research.
I have a couple of questions about this quotation regarding the what is contained in the canon.
Yeah.
First of all, can you reiterate what the source penitential of that one is?
Sorry,
Where does this quotation come from again? I might have missed it. Sorry.
which
And the prima enim ad notat. Yes. one.
this is from an Episcopal statute.
Okay,
And it's called Capitula Parisiensia.
I can see that I'm going to have to. Not because I'm against it, but because I will have to revise something and it's already improved. But so I have, well, I don't know, my version is a little bit different, but I assume that I need to cite the earlier one, and Jesse of Amiens would be later than this. He
Which
would,
one? Which one is
Jesse of Amiens would be then
Yeah.
later, so I need to change it. But I did think you might be interested to know that there's a 10th century London manuscript that I was examining.
Yep.
And it has a lot of things that were compiled in the 9th century. So it's 9th, 10th century, and I was looking at the apocryphal letter from heaven in it,
Yep.
and I discussed this manuscript a little bit at length in this article, stating how ironic it is that we have this section about biblical canon, and what is interpolated right there is the letter, the apocryphal letter from heaven, which is completely outside of the canon and it has no space in the canon whatsoever. So it's,
Was that written in the margin?
yes.
Yeah.
So I thought I wrote that it was delightfully ironic that this is being juxtaposed with something that is specifically on the canon, and then other standard doctrinal works like Gennadius is there and some other things. But I see that you really pointed something out that I'm gonna have to fix before it goes to second group. So
So there's been some use of this.
thank you. Yeah, maybe we can talk after.
But no, to come back to my point of looking at the manuscripts, this shows that the user of the reader of the manuscripts regarded the letter from heaven as a letter that was not of the same authority perhaps as the rest, but was it fitted into this manuscript, was comparable with the other texts.
That's what I was trying to figure out, is where does it occur in these places? And in this case, I thought the juxtaposition was very interesting. I mean, in every case, it's not possible to determine, but
Yeah.
looking at strange texts like that, and what is next to penitentials? Are there other strange texts that end up being put right before, right after the penitentials that could be something to force a
Yeah.
student to do it?
Yeah. And two of my colleagues, Karin van Rijn and Irene van Renswoude, who would also have been here. They have this program of anonymous texts that are somehow related or written in margin. So that those would be people to talk to if you're interested.
Mhm. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your paper. I've got one question concerning this remark by Rosamund McKittrick that you mentioned about canonical collections being sort of history books.
Yeah.
I suppose the Pseudo-Isidorian decretals would be a case in point to illustrate this, perhaps. But my question would rather be whether contemporaries would also have, what would contemporaries have done with Irish material that you also mentioned? Would there have been a way for contemporaries to conceptualize Christian history, ecclesiastical history, by referring to Irish materials, by excluding Irish materials? Is there a conscious approach by contemporaries as to the origin of certain materials and to shaping history or is it rather a look from modernity onto this material to see it as a kind of history book?
I see Rosamund's point, and I think for some collections, that's certainly a good possibility. I'm not sure whether, I wouldn't say that this is the purpose of all of these manuscripts. So there are clearly manuscripts that have a more practical purpose than that were used in some way or another. I'm not so sure whether people will be able to see whether this is an Irish text or not, I think. But I'm reminded of, what is it, the collection in 5 books, which has portraits of important figures, also images. And they have Cumianus, for example, so that's an Irish abbot. And they also have a Paterius, which should be Patrick. So they know something, but they don't know exactly who or what. For the author of this collection, these were apparently acceptable authorities in what is this late and early definition. So there's also a change there for what is accepted as an authority. So Bede would first not be accepted. But we know of 2 on board of trolls would say, yes, Bede, you can read because they think that it's the real Bede, although it's not a real.
Thank you very much. My interest in clergy makes me to return to the question raised already by Jennifer, or the point addressed already by Jennifer. So the canon saying that the presbyteries should know canons, and you are certainly right that we shouldn't imagine that they were meant to learn the entire Hispana or whatever. But I wonder whether possibly they didn't mean anything specific at all. I'm thinking about it because you can see this tradition of saying that the clergy should know the canons already at the end of the 4th century. So there's a tradition of repeating it. You can see it in the canons of African councils in the 390s. So maybe just they don't think what they actually should know. It's canons, whatever they are.
I think I would take a historical stance. I want to know what people at that time thought they might mean by that, and that doesn't need to be the same in the 8th century.
Yes, obviously.
So that's one of the problems I'm puzzling is what might this have meant? Is this just a legal fiction, which it could also be a possibility? Of course, they have to know it, but as we in the Dutch law, it also says we as Dutchmen, we should know the law. Nobody knows the law by heart, of course. So it can be a legal fiction as it is in modern days, but I don't think it is. It is a bit more than that. But what it exactly is and how it changes over time, that's something that we don't know yet. Does that somehow?
Yes, I think so. Yeah.
Okay, so I have time for one last question. Just a question about Theodosius of Amanuensis, who appears, I believe, as the author of one of the imperative you showed us.
Theodore of Orleans wrote one of the statues.
Yeah,
Yes,
yeah.
certainly.
It was probably the first.
Yeah,
Is
it
always
was,
the first.
it was as far as we know, the first one. Yeah.
Could you show us back the slides, please? Because
Theodore did not talk about it.
Ah.
This is Walter
no.
Orleans.
Oh, it's not
But Theodore of Orleans does not require priests to know the canons. At least he doesn't have to.
That
write
was
Yeah.
my question.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, so it doesn't not at all.
He doesn't mention it at all.
Possibly could show that it was not referring to a book. But Theodorus is always pointing to text and not an idea.
Okay.
He is very focused on, corpora manuscripts, in the codex, and I don't know.
Yeah.
I have to find out when
I'm
it's.
thinking does Theodore, I don't know from the top of my head, does he also have a requirement that we should own this book, that book, that
Yes,
book, that book?
and show
And
their
show it to the
books
bishop.
to
Yeah.
the bishop,
Yeah,
for the
that's
bishop to.
Yeah,
yes,
yeah.
Check them.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it could show that
It's not about the specific book, specific
That-
text. Yeah,
it's a
Okay.
good question.
yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Our next speaker is Professor Jennifer Davis from the Harvard University of America. She is a historian of early medieval Western Europe. Her first book, Dominance after the Empire, published by Harvard University Press in 2018. Medieval ruler and how he and his men attempted to control his vast empire. Her current project, Per Capitularis Nostris, Law and its uses in the Frankish kingdom, examines how the Frankish kings produced law and how people in the Frankish orbit sought to push those laws to use. Based extensively on the surviving manuscripts of Frankish Capitularis, the book examines how and why various communities copied and used royal law for their own purposes. Today, Jennifer paper will be purifying the past and Charlemagne's life.
All right. Thank you. Thank you. Oh. So, thank you for the introduction.
Share it with the people in this.
It is,
Okay.
it says you are shares,
Okay. Sorry.
I think.
Yes.
Okay.
Stop share.
Okay. So, and thank you, of course, to Yaniv for all his work organizing and to the Institute for having me back. So, I'm going to, in some ways, pick up where Rob left off in certain respects. Here begin the chapters which our father of good memory, Pippin, established in council, synodaliter, and which we want to be conserved by all. So begins what may be the earliest piece of legislation associated with the Frankish king Charlemagne, who is the we voice in the text I just quoted. And this law is an example of a type of legal text that historians call capitularies because of their typical chapter format. Now, capitularies are a specifically Frankish form of law that emerged in the post-Roman legal landscape. And particularly for the Carolingian dynasty, the capitularies express most fully some of the key political ideas and practices of the era. They thus serve to distinguish the Franks in legal terms from their neighbors and constituted an essential political tool for the Carolingian and arguably Merovingian rulers. While just about everything about capitularies has been debated, they remain an essential source for understanding the political practices and the worldview of the Carolingians. So for our purposes today, I would like to use this genre of law to help explore how the Carolingians used historical references to shape narratives about the past that emphasized the stories that the family wanted to tell. Now, that the Carolingians often trafficked in sanitized retellings of history in support of their own political aims and family politics is well known. The dynasty sponsored and encouraged extensive history writing, resulting in a corpus of texts that told stories of the development of Frankish history with a clear pro-Carolingian slant, justifying the ascendance of the Pippinid Arnulfing line and the deposition of their Merovingian predecessors. That the Carolingians embedded such historical arguments into the capitularies has not yet been subject to significant analysis, which is the project that I hope to begin here. So doing allows us further insight into how the capitularies worked as tools of communication, knitting together a Frankish political community, and enriches our view of the Carolingian cultural predilection for using manipulated views of the past to advocate for present and often contested goals. I will take as my corpus to make this argument the capitularies produced during the reign of Charlemagne, who ruled from 768 to 814. Charlemagne's capitularies constitute a useful body of evidence for our purposes because Charlemagne produced more capitularies than any other Frankish ruler, and because the emergence and refining of Frankish historical writing occurred simultaneously to the legal developments. Addressing later capitularies would also allow one to explore how the capitularies themselves became a separate self-referential corpus with clear historical horizons, but time today will not permit us to extend the investigation. Nonetheless, the capitularies of Charlemagne offer us a range of examples of historical arguments embedded into laws in service of advocating for visions of the past and an often simplified and sanitized past in order to justify decisions in the present. I cannot address today all examples one can discover in the capitularies of Charlemagne, but I hope an examination of a few key case studies will allow us to explore both how the historical arguments shape the capitularies as a corpus and how they contribute to a Carolingian discourse about a purified and politically sanitized past. So before we begin our analysis, a word must be said about why this angle of scholarship is perhaps a bit surprising when applied to the capitularies. So Carolingianists have become closely attuned to the ways in which various sources make historical arguments and how deeply a historical mindset shaped Carolingian intellectual culture. But the capitularies are still perhaps an unexpected place to look for historical arguments, and that is because they are a highly presentist body of law. First of all, the capitularies contain much material that we might best characterize as political or administrative, rather than legal in a strict sense of statute law. The capitularies are full of clauses that were directed at only specific circumstances and which had no long-term validity. It is entirely typical for a given capitulary to include material that was indeed legal in a narrow sense, meant to establish lasting normative expectations for the Frankish world, next to a temporary administrative measure. We can find a clear example in the double capitulary of Thionville from 805. So the second clause in the general section of the capitulary announces the importance of assuring justice for churches, widows, orphans, and wards, insisting that their claims be carefully heard and not dismissed. This idea is omnipresent in Carolingian sources and can be found all over the capitularies. The vision of royal justice sustaining the weak is one of the leitmotifs of Carolingian political thought, shaping both the ideology and practice of rulership. The court authors who constructed the capitulary meant for this clause to be of enduring and general validity. A few chapters later, we run into a very different type of clause. This later chapter, which is chapter 7 up there, regulates trade across the lucrative but sensitive eastern frontier, seeking to channel exchange to certain trading centers to ensure that weapons were not sold outside the empire, and even more importantly, to make certain the king and his men got their cut from the tolls merchants paid. Now, the problem with the chapter is that it names the trading centers and the men responsible for overseeing them. Given the flux in administrative geography and the inevitable turnover in personnel, which was also consciously encouraged under Charlemagne, there is no way that this clause would not have quickly become outdated. Even if the basic principles of trade management and frontier organization persisted, and in this case it is arguable if they did, the naming of sites and agents meant that the clause was firmly grounded in the particular moment of the text issue. And indeed, this is a very well-copied capitulary, and later scribes sometimes, not always, leave out the names of the agents, and they frequently make a mess of the place names, which were clearly often unfamiliar to them. So this combination of legislative principles meant to be continuously followed with arguments that would inevitably be superseded is typical of the capitularies and is indicative of their status as law. They were never statute law in any modern sense. Rather, they were a combination of political, legal, and religious claims that were packaged into collections of chapters at particular moments for particular goals, not all of which were meant to persist for any length of time. Now, this deeply presentist cast to the capitularies, which is one of their most marked features, has perhaps led us to overlook the extent to which the capitularies do express a historical viewpoint, or rather viewpoints. And indeed, much of the force of the historical references in the capitularies emerges from their rarity and their imbrication in texts otherwise fully grounded in their own present. That is, much of their power stems from how these historical moments interrupt the resolutely present-focused language of the capitularies, and in so doing, allows us to see how these historical interpolations allow the compilers of capitularies to make arguments about their present. So with this background in mind, let us return to the capitulary that I began with. That text is a collection of chapters that seems to have been compiled under the direction of Charlemagne's father, Pippin, during his conquest of the Duchy of Aquitaine. The heading that ascribes its reissue to Charlemagne, however, is the only clear indication we have of the text's origin and purpose. The heading is found in the only surviving manuscript, which was most likely compiled in the early 10th century. And this is already an indication that we need to look again at the reference. It was almost certainly added much later, and I think probably after Charlemagne's death, even though the heading uses his voice. The kind of chronological scaffolding of the capitularies that we see in this manuscript is not at all typical of early collections and only emerges in Frankish manuscripts towards the end of the Carolingian period. This historical reference then, while interesting, is not, to my mind, contemporary with the capitularies. But it does serve to underscore for us how inserting chronological indicators into the capitularies can give them new meaning and new force. In this case, by insisting on a Frankish royal tradition of lawgiving. The examples that I will focus on for the remainder of my time today are integral to the capitularies as they were produced during Charlemagne's own reign. But this first example helps us remember that these kinds of historical notes are never incidental in the capitularies. They're trying to tell us something, and we need to unpack their role in the text to understand the kind of work they were meant to do to convey the meaning of the capitulary. This heading reminds us that historical markers are consequential, so we should seek to understand them, and warns us not to take them at face value. Now, whether or not Charlemagne ever reissued Pippin's regulations with such a comment is unclear, but a text telling us he did should always be questioned. The Carolingians felt history was a particularly apt vehicle to make political arguments. They were willing to manipulate or flat out lie to get the past to reflect what they wanted. Now, this heading, if in fact inaccurate, is not much of a distortion, but it tells us more about its early 10th century moment of copying than about the moment of reissue it purports to describe. So with this in mind, let us turn to some examples from Charlemagne's capitularies of how historical markers serve to create a curated view of the past in support of present goals. So my first case study comes from one of the most famous capitularies Charlemagne's court produced, which text you've now already met, the so-called Admonitio Generalis of 789. You're looking at an early copy here. Now, the capitulary as a whole sets out a vision of religious correction that would animate the Carolingian project of social, religious, and political reform historians now refer to, using Carolingian language, as renovatio. The Admonitio is, if you will, the roadmap and policy statement behind the royal vision of renovatio, a vision that was taken up and transformed by institutions and individuals throughout the Carolingian world. As Rob's already talked about, the first half of the capitulary consists of a group of canons reworked from the Dionysio Hadriana canon collection. The second half is a group of original chapters setting out the royal program of reform and where it should begin. Now, this text starts with a remarkable preface in the voice of Charlemagne, addressed particularly to the bishops of the empire, though more broadly to the population as a whole, and written at least partly by Charlemagne's famous English advisor, Alcuin. Here is the text. Now, in this preface, Charlemagne justifies his reordering and supplementing of canon law by comparing his own efforts to the work of the biblical king Josias. And I quote, "For we read in the books of Kings how holy Josias strove to recall the kingdom given to him by God to the worship of the true God by visiting, correcting, and admonishing." Not, the preface is keen to remind us, out of the false belief that Charlemagne could match the sanctity of Josias, but rather out of a desire to follow the example of the saints. Now, this passage has been extensively commented on and is clearly part of a Carolingian and more broadly early medieval concern to ground kingship on religious foundations and reflects the deep Carolingian interest in the Old Testament and its world of kings. The use of Josiah as a model is not typical in Carolingian sources and may go back to the influence of Theodulf of Orleans, who we just heard about, another influential intellectual rather than to Alcuin. It's been debated. Nonetheless, the evocation of Josiah is obviously part of a discourse on the biblical basis of Carolingian kingship, and the Admonitio Generalis is often seen as the fons et origo of what would become a common Carolingian justification and interpretation of rulership. But I would like to suggest here a somewhat different way of reading this preface. So first we need to note that Josiah is not the standard biblical figure that a medieval ruler would be compared to, as I've just said. Indeed, Josiah does show up occasionally in Carolingian sources, primarily after Charlemagne, but not in any kind of sustained or consistent way. Now, the image may be powerful, but it was quickly discarded, at least for several decades. Moreover, the use of biblical models to shape Carolingian ideas of rulership has been so frequently discussed because it's clearly important. But we should be careful to take account of where and when such explicit comparisons of Carolingian rulers to biblical kings occur. And I must stress that I do mean here direct comparison to biblical figures, not a broader use of biblical language or ideas, which is in fact omnipresent. So in the case of Charlemagne, direct reference to biblical models is not as common as the scholarly literature sometimes suggests. Charlemagne was indeed regularly called David by his coterie of court intellectuals, led by Alcuin, who was fond of bestowing nicknames, biblical and classical, on his friends, and who encouraged such a trend at Charlemagne's court. Outside of the sophisticated literary musings of poets and courtiers, the direct modeling of rulership on biblical kings is not often applied to Charlemagne in court sources, or indeed in contemporary sources at all. There are, of course, exceptions, but on the whole, such a method of characterizing kingship became much more common later in the Carolingian period than it was during the reign of Charlemagne. Charlemagne's kingship was regularly justified and understood in terms of religious ideas of kingship, but this was not, most of the time, done by drawing a direct link to biblical figures. Third, the comparison to Josiah is typically read as a religious interpretation. Yet it is also a historical one, linking Charlemagne to a line of biblical kingship, one with particular implications in a Christian view of history, and one that underscores the way one learns about the past, namely by reading books. In short, the reference to Josiah directly was a powerful metaphor, but quickly abandoned, and thus perhaps of greater interest to historians than it was to Charlemagne's immediate contemporaries. Explicit biblical analogy to celebrate and justify kingship was more common after Charlemagne's reign than during. And the reference to Josiah needs to be seen not just as an almost timeless biblical model, but as a historical referent, underscoring the time lapse between the days of the Old Testament kings and the Frankish present. So what does these reframings of the Josiah reference leave us with? So part of the reason why such explicit comparisons of Charlemagne to biblical kings do not recur in the capitularies is likely simply personnel. People like Alcuin and Theodulf, who shaped this text, did not typically play a role in the collaborative drafting of capitularies. It is not then that this understanding of biblically based kingship is unimportant. It is just that it was Theodulf and Alcuin's students in the next generation who took the idea and ran with it, making it into a more sustained discourse that indeed infused royal sources. For the reign of Charlemagne, the idea was more of a dead end. But appreciating the novelty of the metaphor, even if it did not succeed, helps us understand why it was used in 789. Now, this was precisely the moment when Charlemagne, after 2 decades of conquests, was moving into a more governmental phase of his reign, of figuring out how to rule the vast territory he had rather speedily conquered. There was no good model for the Franks of how to do this because the Franks had never ruled a territory of that extent before. Perforce, Charlemagne's approach had to be different. Moreover, 789 is also exactly when we see the court beginning to use capitularies in new and different ways, employing them as tools of rulership in a manner Pippin had never attempted. It is in light of the new political challenges Charlemagne faced and his court's often novel efforts to deal with those obstacles that emphasizing the historical implications of the ab initio's use of Josias is most helpful. What Charlemagne did in the ab initio was, in many ways, in fact, new. Evoking Josias as a way to explain those actions gave them a historical continuity with the actions of Old Testament kings, and in typical early medieval style, glossed over innovation by evoking old custom. At a moment when Charlemagne was trying to do things that Frankish kings had not previously done, his court evoked a model to justify these new royal interventions. The novelty smoothed over by being connected to what biblical kings did, a model that was also conveniently far enough removed in time to not be easily comparable to what Charlemagne was trying to do. And the insistence that we know this by reading it in the books of Kings helped turn the aristocrats the text was addressed to into a community of helpers for the king, into a group of people defined by their common reading, their shared religious culture, and their, from the court's perspective, desired participation in Charlemagne's new political project. The biblical past is here deployed to justify political innovation in the Carolingian present and to bring aristocrats into a community shaped by both common reading and participation in political life. Harkening back to the past can also have the effect of making present circumstances less clear. We can find an example in a set of paired capitularies from 811. The first text is a sort of list of questions for consideration by the elite, divided into groups of bishops, abbots, and counts, who should all be spoken with separately. The second text, produced shortly thereafter, is less a set of answers than a sequence of additional reflections on many of the topics raised in the first text. Now, the relationship between these two texts is not entirely clear. Ginty Nelson has suggested that we understand the follow-up capitulary, quote, as a series of afterthoughts or further thoughts set down in some haste as a postscript, perhaps following a night's reflection. One topic addressed in both lists of topics is monasticism and the proper rule to guide monastic life. So the first capitulary inquires if all monks really need to follow the Benedictine rule and proposes to investigate the question by considering if there were monks in Gaul before the arrival of the rule. The second capitulary reports that, yes, indeed, there were monks in Gaul before the rule of Benedict, citing the important case of one of the Franks' favorite saints, Saint Martin, who was a monk and supervised other monks and lived long before Benedict. This I'm summarizing for the non-Latins. Now, for the compilers of the capitulary, this piece of information raised a further question. By what rule did those monks live before the arrival of the rule of Saint Benedict? Now, these linked capitularies have been well studied, not least by Ginty Nelson in the course of her analysis of the capitularies, where we get tantalizing glimpses of what she has called the voice of Charlemagne. However, there is more to be said about these comments on monasticism and what they imply for our narratives of monastic reform. That the Carolingians thought the purity of monastic life was essential for the good of the empire was clear. Charlemagne's father and uncle already began to attempt to reform monastic practice, evident in both the revival of conciliar activity under their joint reign and in their own early legislation. Charlemagne took up the endeavor, insisting in even stronger terms on the importance of monasticism, perhaps most stridently in a capitulary chapter that excoriated monks practicing sodomy, because such behavior among those meant to be pure put the salvation of the entire empire at risk. It's a long chunk of Latin, but basically this is very impure, bad, no. So, however, while Charlemagne's court insisted that monks must follow a rule, they did not consistently command that it had to be the rule of Saint Benedict. It was only under Louis the Pious, Charlemagne's son and heir, that the court pursued a clear, sustained, top-down policy of legislating that all monasteries follow the rule of Saint Benedict. Now, many houses had no interest in so doing, and it took extensive effort and force to get them to comply, although Louis succeeded in achieving such compliance in the end. However, the passages from the 811 agendas help remind us that Charlemagne's approach was not Louis's, and that his court never reached a definitive position on whether all monks had to follow the Benedictine rule. So, as Rob talked about, the Carolingians have sometimes many viewpoints, not one. There's a debate. The historical references embedded in these texts then reveal two key points for us. So first of all, when it came to monastic reform, Charlemagne's court was unified in the importance ascribed to the topic, but divided in terms of the desired approach. Capitularies were typically written collaboratively, as I've mentioned. They incorporate the voices of many. And these particular capitularies let us see some of the discussion amongst those at court, and let us hear more from those less convinced that the rule of Benedict was the only valid approach to monastic life. The agendas reach no conclusion, but they insist that their listeners and participants in discussion think about the options for monastic life. The historical references embedded in these texts then help us see the dissent and discussion that characterized the court. The use of historical examples allowed the bishops, abbots, and counts taking part in the assemblies of 811 to debate and to challenge each other's ideas. In this case, looking to the past did not produce a direct answer, but rather allowed those at court to contest the emphasis on the rule of Saint Benedict. The vision of the past evoked in the capitulary is once again simplified and sanitized. There were, in fact, many forms and contexts of monastic life in Gaul before Benedict. One hardly needs to stop at Martin. However, reducing the complex landscape of pre-Benedictine monastic life to Martin alone, the most famous of the Gallic saints, allowed those compiling the capitulary to assert the equal validity of other forms of monastic life and to encourage further investigation into that rich landscape, a project indeed eventually undertaken by Benedict of Aniane, albeit in support of his ultimate argument that the rule of Saint Benedict was the best option after one had surveyed all the other possibilities. Evoking the past in these agendas then opens up new ways to debate monastic life in the present. A second important conclusion we can draw from this example is to emphasize the text's reflection on how one learns about the past and how that shapes community. As with the Ab Initio Generalis, those taking part in those discussions are part of a community formed by knowledge, by reading in particular. Being able to read about the past was the price of admission for those who wanted to take part in political debates during the reign of Charlemagne. By embedding these historical references into capitulary texts, which are often the written records of assembly discussions, the capitularies help foster the kind of political community the court depended on, one that found key ideas in books and then used those ideas to debate and discuss. The capitularies themselves were never compiled and disseminated by the court. Rather, Carolingian rulers depended on individual aristocrats to copy and transmit the capitularies. The historical references in these two agendas help us see how Charlemagne and his court sought to use the capitularies themselves to shape the kind of political engagement that would then lead to further dissemination of capitularies. The historical references then are ways to make present arguments, but also to mold the kind of political community the court wanted to work with. For my final example, I would like to turn from a historical reference to the much more recent past. In a capitulary issued in the early 9th century, the court made reference to events in Bavaria in the time of the deposed Duke Tassilo and his wife Luperga. So in order to understand this reference, we need to say a little bit about the conquest of Bavaria and its impact on Frankish historiography. Bavaria was an independent duchy, albeit under more or less loose Frankish overlordship. In the 780s, Charlemagne made a concerted effort to take over Bavaria and depose Duke Tassilo, who was his cousin. Enlisting the support of the papacy, Charlemagne and his armies eventually encircled Bavaria, precipitating the surrender of the Bavarian elite, the deposition of Tassilo and his family, and their eventual relegation to monasteries. The 788 surrender was followed by the 794 Synod of Frankfurt, where Tassilo was pulled out of his monastery and once again made to abjure publicly any claim to Bavaria. To justify this takeover of Bavaria, the Royal Frankish Annals, a court history of the reign of Pippin, Charlemagne, and Louis the Pious, invented an elaborate story of Tassilo becoming a vassal of Pippin and reneging on his military responsibilities to aid the Franks. The careful work of scholars, including Matthias Becker, has made clear that the story in the Royal Frankish Annals is an ex post facto fiction meant to justify a usurpation. The desire to defend the absorption of Bavaria, a thriving, sophisticated principality that had been a real rival to the Franks, is so central to the agenda of the Royal Frankish Annals that it has been argued that the text began to be composed right around the date of the takeover on the basis of earlier notes. While I have questioned elsewhere how strongly we should link the dating of the composition of the Royal Frankish Annals to the events in Bavaria, the Annals' depiction of the takeover is unquestionably a compelling example of the Carolingian approach to using history to make political arguments. The Annals' story of Bavaria and Tassilo was full of lies and inventions, replete with misogynistic attacks blaming Luperga, whose sister, incidentally, Charlemagne had divorced, and whose father, the King of Italy, he had also conquered and deposed, all in the service of justifying the Carolingian takeover of the duchy. So it is with this background in mind that we need to look at the reference to Tassilo and Luperga in a capitulary produced around a decade after the Synod of Frankfurt. So the actual mention of Tassilo and Luperga is rather anodyne. It does not do much more than indicate a time horizon, though certainly there are hints of the disruption of the takeover in the reference to those who transferred their fidelity to the Franks. And a large portion of the Bavarian aristocracy seemingly did so, paving the way for the surrender of the duchy. Why then would the Franks choose to mention the deposed duke and his wife after spending so much time and effort slandering them and removing them from the story? So indeed, scholars have argued that Tassilo and Luperga were such a threat that they stimulated desperate attempts to reframe the situation and firmly excise Tassilo from the history of Bavaria. Yet if this is so, why mention him after expending so much energy to push him out of the way? I would argue that this reference to Tassilo is part of a larger series of mentions of him in court sources in the years after the deposition that helped to assert a different narrative. Once the first effort at defamation had succeeded and Tassilo was successfully removed from Bavaria, the further series of references to him, not just in this capitulary, but in another capitulary, in charters, and in narrative sources, allowed the court to make a new argument. Tassilo had been rightly deposed. He was no longer a threat. He was simply Charlemagne's predecessor in Bavaria. The capitulary chapter dates events not just by Tassilo and Luperga, but by Charlemagne's father Pippin and his grandfather Charles Martel. The Carolingians remain unnamed, but evoking Tassilo and Luperga explicitly allows Charlemagne to demonstrate his mastery of Bavaria and confidence in his rule. They're no longer a threat to be avoided. Now, this interpretation is further buttressed by the inclusion of Luperga. She was the object, as I've noted, of particularly vitriolic Frankish attack. She is also one of very, very few women mentioned by name in the capitularies, and she could have been easily left out here. The inclusion of Luperga further reminds a Carolingian audience of the whole sequence of events surrounding not just Bavaria, but Charlemagne's conquest of Italy and deposition of Luperga's father Desiderius. Bringing her up shows she and her family, biological and marital, were no longer a danger. They were the past, and Charlemagne was the present, whose hold on Bavaria, not to mention Italy, was now, to Frankish eyes, unquestioned. The historical markers in this capitulary then allow the court to assert an interpretation of history that reduces the messy conquest of Bavaria to a clear, uncontested view of Charlemagne's supremacy and rightful status as conqueror. In this case, the simplified and sanitized version of the past presented in the text is somewhat extraneous to its immediate content, but it provided an opportunity for the Carolingian court to assert an aggressive, confident new version of the history of Bavaria and its incorporation into the Frankish Empire, and to do so to the Bavarian audience to whom the capitulary was directed. So as a body of texts, as I've noted, the capitularies are very firmly grounded in specifics of time and place. A list of topics to be discussed that records about that animal enclosure at our palace of Attigny is perhaps an extreme example, but it's reflective of the characteristic presentist focus of the genre. Yet, because they are so rare, the moments when the capitularies include historical markers are worthy of our attention. Such references are chosen carefully for different reasons in different cases, but as part of a strategy of using references to the past to shape arguments about the present. Such references range from the streamlined, as with the evocation of Josias, to the selective, as in the case of Martin and his monks, to the manipulative, as in the case of Tassilo and Lotperga. However, I suggest turning our attention to these historical markers in the capitularies has two major benefits to offer. First, it allows us to expand our analysis of the historical mindset in the Carolingian period, and to enrich our understanding of how the Carolingians used historical models of various kinds, typically simplified, purified, or both, to make arguments. Such ways of thinking were not confined to historiographical text strictly understood, and analyzing this way of arguing as an aspect of Carolingian culture more broadly gives us new avenues to pursue in terms of examining historiography and the uses of history. Such references also help us understand the capitularies themselves in a new light. The historical markers that we have seen help shape the Frankish aristocracy into a political community, one linked by reading, by education, by religious beliefs, by debating, by participating in conquest, by being able to unpack the historical moments embedded in texts like the capitularies. Understanding how these historical references were being used required participation in Carolingian political networks. The capitularies both expressed a particular understanding of historical moments, but also themselves reinforced the tools needed to interpret the references correctly. In addition to their explicit content, capitularies broadcast messages about how the past can be purified in service of a Carolingian vision of the present. Thank you.
Yes. Do you think perhaps that there's a specific purpose also didactically in the present to Charlemagne's choice of Josiah specifically, rather than another king? You know, Josiah is the king who's associated with religious reform, with the purification of worship in the temple, the restoration of right worship, you know, possibly editing or compilation of biblical texts, etc. So is he also announcing a program in the present that he's justifying through that?
Yeah, sure. No, thanks for the question. I should have brought that out a little more clearly. Yes, definitely. It's his deployment at the in the admonitio, which really again does set this religious agenda. And as Rob was also talking about, it begins with this selective and careful editing of the admonitio. Of the Dionysia Hadriana into a sort of new Carolingian version. Absolutely. This is not just because we want a biblical king. This is a specific. So there has been debate about where the metaphor comes from or where the image comes from. I do tend to think it's probably Theodulf. So I mean, I don't think this is Charlemagne per se. But I think I think Theodulf's interested in it. I would most likely expect it's coming from him, though again, that bit's been contested. I think there's also a fair amount of language about rectitude in Vulgate translation of Kings around Josias, and that's a word the Carolingians put a lot of weight on and they like, and it's very central to Charlemagne's legislation. So I think there's also probably that particular word is evoking some of this. So yes, definitely. I was just trying to sort of add in that it's also historical because it's been seen sort of solely as setting this religious agenda. I think it's doing more work than just that. And I think also because the admonitio itself is so successful a text, we might put more emphasis than we do on the fact that you know, the text itself works, but the preface kind of you know, it's sort of, historians think the idea is fascinating, and certainly Charles of Bald's court did. But immediately, they just walk away from it, which is pretty common of Charlemagne's court. They try things and it's like, well, all right, moving on. So that's the tweak I was trying to make, but absolutely, it is a very consequential choice, and that part has been, I think, very well explained in the literature previously.
Thanks.
Thanks, Jenny. So the victories are one kind of law made
Yeah.
at Charlemagne's court, and we've already talked about Dionysus Hadrianus, or Dionysus is kind of another one. The other one though is the Lex Salica, right? It's not made at Charlemagne's
Yeah,
court, but
it's
it's revised and lots of manuscripts made. And of course, that's a very historical text, right?
Yeah.
By the time
Yeah.
Charlemagne is
Yep.
revising
Yep.
it, and I'm wondering how
Yeah.
this fits in then with your image. That's very. I mean, is it the case then? That's the kind of his historical law is in the Lex Salica, and this is the victories are like the update. These are ones for now. So should we be seeing them in working in tandem? Sort of, in terms of references to history.
Yeah, that's interesting characterization. So, I mean, I think part of the difficulty is it's so hard to know exactly what they're doing with the Lex of Salica in the late 8th century and the 9th century. I mean, you know, Karl Ubel says is the best answer we've got. So I'm not sure I would want to say that the Lex Salica is solely historical to them. I mean, it's certainly anachronistic, but I think it does other work in a Frankish context. I mean, I do think that there is legal concepts, at least, that go back to the Lex Salica that are relevant, not in the case of sort of case law to be applied, as again, Rob has already pointed out. But there are aspects of practice and institutions that continue. There is also, we could have I think the sort of some of the walking back of seeing the Salic law as sort of overstating the Franks as sort of chosen people, and the more sort of restrained kind of work that Gerda Heidemann has done. It has been a helpful contribution. But I mean, there's certainly something to be said for this text as a Frankish text and as an identity text. So I think they are well aware that it's historical and it has things to say about the past. And some of the particularly, depending on which recension we're talking about in the shorter prologue with reference to lawmakers, et cetera, which also links it into certain other national laws. So I mean, I think there's the historicals there, but I would say I don't think it's solely historical. In terms of what Charlemagne's doing in the capitularies, I mean, part of it is he creating some kind of present law. Yes, that's part of what he's doing. But he uses the capitularies in a range of ways, and irregularly and inconsistently. So there, I would also hesitate to give an answer about this is the purpose of the capitularies. It is not, there are a range of them. So I guess I would stay away from one is present, one's past. I do think the capitularies are primarily presentist, but I do think, when I, for the purposes of this talk, started thinking through what I might say, and I had started with some of the more explicit purity passages, like the one about the sodomy that I put up. But when I started looking for this, there's actually more of this than I expected. So I think that there is a historical framework there. That's perhaps a long, unnecessarily long answer, but. Yes.
I have a question.
Yes.
Which is, I certainly see the sense in the division or the grouping you're making, right? These 3 case studies, sort of past versus present. So
Yeah.
New present
Mhm.
to get the past. There are also 3 very different kinds of
Yes.
past, right?
Yes.
The way you know about Tassilo is very different from
Yes.
the way you know about Josiah. So
Yes.
can you speak a little about the differences of using something that's so distant in the past, something that the audience of this may have remembered?
Sure. Yeah, and again, my first 2 examples, both, I think that's part of why they're both putting emphasis on the books. And that how do you know about things that happened that far long ago is you read the books. But again, I think the signaling of the fact that it's an actual written book, which sort of came out of the discussion as well of Rob's paper, I think that matters. It's significant that it's in the books. Tassilo, of course, is very different. Yes, people have lived through it. but of course, in the Tassilo case, they just make stuff up, right? Now, by the time that we're dealing with this capitulary, which is hard to date, but early 9th century is a decent date. By that point, we're, depending on how you want to date the Royal Frankish Annals, we're 15 years into a very consistent Frankish narrative that retells this story. So there's certainly, I think, for people in a Frankish orbit, they've heard this version before. But yes, in some ways, to me, though, the Tassilo markers are the most interesting because they're the most brazen. And it's that's why I think that there really is a sort of assertiveness to those references. Tassilo is partly deposed because he really is a threat. The Bavarians are a threat. And that there's been good work on exploring how that works and et cetera. And it's absolutely true. I just think that by the time we get to the Synod of Frankfurt, so already by 794, to me, that dragging Tassilo out is already an assertion of authority. And it comes out of, at the end of a couple of difficult years, but it comes at a way where Charlemagne has put down the last of what turned out to be the last of the serious revolts. There was a difficult famine, but he's sort of, there's a lot of assertiveness, I think, going on around what's going on in the whole Synod of Frankfurt and the kinds of religious and political claims that he's making there. So I would see that as being part of that narrative. So that, I think, is a real sort of speaking to political community in the sense of generating a narrative that people need to buy into, as opposed to the earlier ones where, again, it's more focused on that book and the book creating that community. But so circling around your question, I think that one thing that does link them is that I do think that there are ways of constructing a political community because it's creating a discourse that people can belong to. If you've read those books, if you understand those references, if you know this story, you can be part of this conversation. Does that help?
Yes.
That's for your conversation. That's really inspiring. My question is not about the issues you've addressed. So
Yes.
If you do not want to answer,
Okay.
I will certainly
Sure. Yeah.
understand.
Yep.
You depict a reign of Charlemagne, very historical, meaning that he needs history to set basis for his reign. I have the feeling that the reign of Louis appears is the exactly opposite. Because if you read Louis' Capitularies, it's always about status regni, meaning what never changes, what is for eternity.
Yeah.
You agree? That was my question.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that I do think that the tenor from Charlemagne to Louis the Pious is quite radically different. And I've tried to argue that. I think that sometimes the hesitation about that idea in the literature has come from this older historiography that was so unfairly denigrated Louis. And so I think that there's sometimes concern that by trying to draw a contrast between him and Charlemagne, the necessary corollary of that is that Louis is a weak ruler. But they are totally separate things. They're just very different rulers. So I don't think to say Louis did not rule much like his father implies anything about that rulership. So that's the first thing I would want to say there. That said, I think that they rule in radically different ways. So in terms of how Louis situates himself in terms of history, I'm not sure I would say that he doesn't need it. I think he just deploys it in radically different ways. So if you take things like from the very beginning, you know, he uses the imperator, the emperor title from the start. He comes in, it's there, done, okay. I mean, Charlemagne has this ridiculous long mouthful of a title, but he never stops being king, right? It's just a totally different attitude. For Louis the Pious, that Roman model, I think, which is again a historical referent, is very important. So I mean, I don't think it's that he's not interested. I think he's interested in different aspects. Though I do think that you're quite right that and it is in the capitularies, which I also are quite distinct from Louis to Charlemagne. That's what I'm talking about at Leeds, is how they're different. Yeah, using the new edition. I think they're quite, you're right, though, that he is creating a sense of continuity with a Christian Roman past, and also with a sort of timeless sort of foundation of divine rulership that I think is quite marked in the documents that come out of Louis the Pius's reign. And I think in some ways in a more sophisticated way in terms of political ideology, more sophisticated than what you get under Charlemagne's reign, where it's sometimes like, let's just throw stuff at the wall and see what sticks, and okay. So I guess the tweak I would add is I'm not sure it's not historical. It's a different kind of history, and but you're right, it's a more placid one. It's this, at least till we get to 829 and everything falls apart. It is this sense of continuities and of stability in a way that I don't think that Charlemagne projected or fostered. So yeah, no, thank you for the contrast. I quite agree. And I think it's just a balance between that, a different sense of history, but with creating that sense of placidity, perhaps. Yeah.
Oh, I thought Angela.
No,
It's fine. Go ahead.
It might be very quick, or not, but, I was actually just struck by the similarities of your two papers, Marceline, and, the use of historical in the past and so on, and, it's not my field, but I also know that there's a lot of work on the use of the past, and like, and so on, memory.
Yes.
And so I was wondering if you could speak to a bigger picture that's going on here, and something maybe that this
Right.
historiography missed, or, something that needs to be explored and compared.
Yeah. So, yes, I think it's there. And one thing I want to talk to Maria Selena about is the official histories in some of your sources, because that's an official history, but a number of your passages that underscore what the historical sources are. I think that language is interesting. And I hadn't really thought about the language in the capitularies about books in the sense of history books before doing this paper, but I think there's something there that we could maybe have a productive conversation about in terms of the broader discourse of historiography. So yes, of course, it's a major field of research, and the Carolingian studies, Rosamund McKitterick's work has obviously been foundational, Helmut Reimetz, not here, but Yitzhak's written a great study about the Annals of Metz, and the same kind of, Carolingian justification. So I think that the broader narrative certainly has been one thing that Helmut has brought out is the ways in which historical sources carry so much political weight. So there are a lot of things one can do with history in a Carolingian context. It very often is very strikingly political, as well as the emergence under Charlemagne of a body of analytic writing with very complex interrelationships among the texts that we're never going to fully sort out, but that really does give a court viewpoint quite strongly. But that obviously lots of empires are interested in history, but there's, I think, a political weighting that's characteristic of the Carolingian world. Helmut's, some of his more recent work and some of the projects that he's leading now in sort of post-Carolingian things also has been particularly looking at ways in which historical arguments are made beyond historiography itself. So I definitely think that that's something that's the field is going. Rob's quoted when he cited Rosamund's point about other things that can be history books without being explicitly history books. So I think that's something that Carolingianists are really interested in. So I think the political weighting, the history beyond the historiography, I think there's also, some of the sort of minor annals have gotten a lot more attention. So these are, again, analytic sources that used to be sort of seen as derivative, monastic, limited, and they're getting a lot more attention now with wider discussion. But so why the Carolingians foster history so much, and the ways in which you create a real historical discourse. There are local views, you can see non-court perspectives, but it's all in a framing that's quite court strongly. So I think that's another element of the historiography that's been quite strong on the historical front. I'm sure I'm forgetting something, but that's some of what
I would
Uh,
add perhaps I demonstrate
Yeah.
Old Testament use biblical models.
Yeah.
For historiography and for
Yes.
political or
Yes,
stuff.
and yeah, and the sort of. But the interest also then in the classics, so yeah, copying of Christian history, biblical history, but also of classical text and the sort of educational program. So I'm interested in here to hear more from Maria Selena on that, her mention of her work on it, the educational and the framing of a concept. As well as the manuscripts, because we have enough historical manuscripts that they're looking, a really careful study of individual codices and what's in them, and how the redeployment of histories in new manuscript context changes the meaning. So that's, I would say, some of the, I don't know, my fellow Carolingianists, I'm forgetting some. Okay. Yes.
We're running 15 minutes behind. Just regard everything in your program as being 15 minutes too early.
4:30, we reconvene.
Yeah. 4:30. Yep.
Oh,
yeah, this is yeah, then quick.
Oh, that's right. I mean, it's interesting. Isn't it?
Concentrating.
The character historiographical production. It's been procurement out of the art.
Well, yeah.
Well,
I don't know what.
Yeah.
Collected it all.
Yeah.
I wonder.
There's one more thing. Even from an earlier person.
I think maybe this,
It's.
no,
No.
maybe that, I'm not totally sure.
Tell us.
I handed it to somebody and handed the drive. They handed it.
It's been.
This is what it is, but I'm sure.
One. The Roman deacons, and the Roman deacons are extremely powerful. Much more than the present was. And he said that he's buried at St. Lawrence. And he says that those who are, but not really those St. Lawrence himself. And he says, it doesn't help you. It even makes the situation worse if you are buried very close and you are you're in sleep. So yes, there's another threat in this. So they may but this probably you know.
No.
Okay, that you know.
My computer.
If you're-
Oh, that is the thing.
Well, better stay away. But
It should emerge on.
in this case, they're all the same. You keep out. And in this case, it is, you know, think twice. Yes, it may be yes, it may be yes, it may be less. Yeah. Yes.
Take it out, put it back in.
Yes, it is connected with your research.
Last person to use it was you.
Well, it worked fine to me. I don't know.
Good.
Okay, let's talk to Shai. He's the computer guy.
Okay, yeah, otherwise I need to, yeah.
Yes.
Hi,
Yeah.
after you.
Oh, hi.
Hi,
That's right. All right.
Had, wait, do you have another PowerPoint?
I do, but he's running away with it because we can't get it on the.
אבל אני כבר הקראתי, רגע, אני כבר, yeah, but wait.
אני רק רוצה, yes, okay,
Find it on the desk.
interesting. And is it research?
Oh, okay.
First of all,
And the desktop is somewhere else.
it's similar to what we see in late apocalypses, showing you that they know the apocalypse is St. Peter and the things like that.
Yeah, of course, there is lots of.
Oh, you were there. Yeah,
Oh, yes, yes.
No, I'm not
the
there
police
yet.
back. Yes, Mama, you're right. Yes,
There are a lot
But
of-
he's gonna
Yeah,
put it in,
Just make sure it's,
And-
they communicate, right?
yeah.
So.
And
Service
this
value,
Well,
sorry.
Yeah, okay.
No, she- yeah. Yes. Yes, I think it was translated. Wasn't it?
Yeah.
Yes, yes. Good. Interesting, but that's finished.
Yes.
But finished.
I'm not sure what's very, what, I know that I wanna choose, but I'm not sure yet what's.
Okay.
Maybe.
Okay. No, the hell is fun. Oh, this is
Yeah.
interesting. Yeah. It's much more fun than heaven. So. Yes, when I was working on demons, I thought that, where the angels? Yeah. Yes, yeah.
And people, they're much more like, I think there's much more discussion about the way they're living in.
Yes, they're much more physical, yes,
Yeah.
and in a spectacular way.
Yeah.
Yes.
Because they have much more being, that's how I.
Yes. Okay, some coffee.
Here, there's no need to go to leader.
Necessarily speak. I did speak. What we're doing.
Funding. Upcoming. And make sure that your proposal is possible to submit without. Now they check everything, everybody's checking out.
ונכניס את זה לפאורפוינט שהיה עליו. על החוק. כן, זה. הפייפר, תראו זה לנו.
Are you going to leave this one or?
I really hope so. So we do.
Yeah,
On the use of this.
yeah, uh-huh.
Yeah. With your version of my engagement with the scholar is, I called it historiography in the service of the mufti, of the legal scholar.
Right,
Not of the ruler, but of the. legal
yeah, the
scholar.
color.
And so I found it interesting.
Ah, thank you.
That's pretty near the top of the tree, isn't it? All those TikTok videos on.
What do you think, what's he gonna talk about then?
Sounds very bad.
Yeah. The exhibition in the Modern Library.
Oh, yes, I have.
No,
Yeah, you did.
I would see her. Yeah. Yeah. So it's very. I know, yeah, me too. I mean, the catalog's very pretty, but yeah, because I was part of the research. group, So, yeah, I was here. Yeah, I ended up being here for half the year, COVID and everything else, but yeah, when we did Zoom, I was here.
We're gonna do some more legal stuff from Western Europe. I am. So you will be.
It's not bad, it's like 8 or 9 classes.
Yeah, oh, well, we'll be very glad that something else.
Yeah, right, so it was the evening, and it was not like I was up, not the right, when I was up at 3 in the morning. I hope it's the next season, so,
Yeah.
yeah.
Nijmegen in the Netherlands. So, just like Ed, it's also. Have you met him? Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, I suppose Morgan has names, but.
Islamic history, yeah. No, he's also in there.
I'm not sure, yeah, yeah.
Oh, okay. Okay. What? Oh, yeah. Yeah. Well, did you? Okay. Oh, okay. But that was before you were studying. Yeah, okay. Ah, right. I can say maybe Islamic history in Leiden or something, but no, before then. Yeah. Where you? You're from here. Okay, yeah.
So yes. it
Yeah,
is not-
where, it's like once before. Yeah. No, it's my first time Israel, yeah. No, not many. No, yes, it's thinking tonight see the old town or something and I'll be going on the tour. Yeah.
I mean, I.
Yeah,
I do-
flying out early in the morning on Wednesday. Come again, yeah. You just keep the country quiet for a bit, then.
Yeah, so I'm writing a book on it, which there is not, obviously, I'm not anything clearly, but I know all of it. Yes, but I have, they're doing these sessions at least because they're doing the publication around and around the fire for it, so. I have it on my inbox and I have to read it.
How are you going to leave?
Yeah, I'm gonna speak in their session, they organize this area, so I have to read the new editions. It'll be my task when I get.
So she's wearing it up through. Yeah, around that. Different places. For example.
Good to get it done on the first.
Okay.
Oh, yeah, well.
I'm always in it. I sometimes say this, and I'm sure that science is perfectly, I find, and it's maybe different in different. But some sort of stuff. So I teach students, sometimes the ones, you know, grades and additional. They're looking, you know, these A-level, it's advanced. They're looking back, they're looking for the right answer. What we're meant to say, to get H on this space. It's not always, can get you further down. No, and that's. Oh, that'll be great. That's the help. Yeah. Yeah, okay. The bell curve. Yeah. We all must do better at Excel, Marion.
Right, we are reconvening.
But maybe they can get.
If our presenter will come and sit. All right.
But yeah.
Our next presenter will be Sven Mader, who is Associate Professor of Medieval History at Radboud University, Nijmegen. His area of research is the intellectual history of the early Middle Ages in Western Europe, with a particular interest in the social dynamics behind the spread and reception of texts, ideas, and persons, and especially in relation to the Irishmen, Irish learning. In 2018, he published a monograph entitled "The Irish Scholarly Presence at St. Gall: Networks of Knowledge in the Early Middle Ages." And he is currently starting a new ERC project called The Social Life of Early Medieval Normative Texts, which aims to bring the study of canon law into the realm of social history. Without further ado, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that introduction. Thank you, Yanni, for inviting me to speak. I know that at this time of the day, if I go over, I'll be eating in on your time at the reception. So I know you won't be happy with that. So I'll try to flutter through my presentation, make sure that I don't overrun. Let's hope. And again, I will be continuing the theme of normative text, canon law, and Carolingian. So we can pick up where we ended. I'll be coloring it in mostly with pretty pictures from a manuscript. So I hope you can see them and that they will be projected large enough. You shall not eat the blood of any creature whatsoever, whether birds or of beasts. Everyone that eateth blood shall perish from among the people. So says Leviticus book 7, verses 26 and 27. A few books later, Leviticus also says that the weasel and the mouse and the crocodile, the shrew and the chameleon and the stelio and the lizard and the mole shall all be reckoned among unclean things, and whatever touches their carcasses shall be unclean. And this includes earthen vessels, ovens, and pots. Sometime in the 7th or 8th century, some Irishman realized that he had not seen a crocodile for some time, nor, well, actually lizards are indigenous to Ireland. I checked on Wikipedia, but they can't have been too common. And chameleons, he probably never saw a chameleon either. So when he was compiling this practical book of Old Testament rules, known to us as the Liber ex Lege Moysi, he decided to omit this particular sentence, since it probably wasn't very relevant to him. He kept, however, the verses relating to the containers in which these animals were not, the carcasses of these animals were not supposed to fall. As a result, the result is in this particular Liber ex Lega Moysi that Leviticus book 11, verse 33, 35, and 36 now seem to be related to Leviticus 7, 25, 6, and 27. Or so the vessels now seem to be the vessels in which blood is not supposed to fall, or the ones that are rendered unclean when blood falls into it. So this is just an illustration of how the arrangement of copied verses has a distinct influence on the meaning of the verses around it. So it has a distinct influence on the meaning of this biblical decree, and this seems product of deliberate textual reworkings aimed to provide a very practical book and one that omits any context that is not relevant, such as crocodiles and chameleons. It's also, it might sound a little bit frivolous, but it's also a testimony to actual engagement with history, or at least a realization that the Bible is not only a book of divine truth, but also one of historical, with historical repercussions. So the same compiler of the Liber also excluded any verses concerned with ancient Jewish ceremonies or rituals. So he obviously read them and decided not to include them. As I said, these rigorous omissions of historical allusions could actually testify to a consciousness of the fact that the Old Testament is also an account of history. So the Liber ex Lega Moysi attests to a literal and historical interpretation of the Bible, presenting the biblical rules stripped from their biblical context as a collection of practical laws that were to be taken literally and seriously in their own right. In the paper today, I would like to present a potpourri or a smorgasbord of some of the canonical collections that I've studied in the past few years and their engagement with the past. In the last few years, I had the pleasure, thanks to the Gerda Henkel Foundation, to work with canonical works, which I called minor canonical collections, but those are the canonical works that Lotte Keary in her book, and I'm not quite sure if I've got it somewhere. It will come up. Lotte Keary, in her compilation of canonical collections, she calls these usually unstructured books, derivative collections, or simply excerpts. And it's these oddballs that I like the most. So it was these works that I've been working on mostly in the last few years. These are, in many respects, systematic collections, even if they are unsystematic, systematic collections. And they are often seen as a progression, an innovation upon chronological or historical collections. And I'd like to, if that's the case, I would actually like to look at historical collections first to just see if that, if the engagement with the past is really so different. So canonical collections originally were chronologically or historically arranged. These were made up principally of decisions of ecumenical councils, and after those, when they were presented usually chronologically, not all the time, papal letters. Here you see an example of the Collectio San Blasiana, which is a historically arranged collection, although actually the councils are not strictly speaking chronologically arranged, but they are presented fully, so completely, and they're presented first, and afterwards we find the papal letters. As such, simply their arrangement makes that these historical collections stressed the importance of a hierarchical canonical tradition and an essential duality between ancient conciliar authority, so these are the councils first, and the ever-growing papal jurisdiction. And Michael Elliott wrote a very interesting article in defense of the study of historical collections, which you can find online. And he wrote, and he noted that no compiler could have been blind to the fact that while the ancient canons comprised a more or less fixed corpus of law, the body of laws produced by popes was recent and ever expanding. So this is the duality that are sort of ingrained in these collections. Eliot writes further on, historical collections were intended as windows to the ancient canonical tradition of the church, preserved in its proper historical contexts, its spiritual authoritative status intact. So it's quite obvious that these canonical collections have a very clear relation with the past and a very clear engagement with the past. Now, these perspectives were challenged from the early 8th century onwards by a new innovation, the great systematically arranged canonical collections. We have a few that actually predate the early 8th century, but from the early 8th century, we get a few really big ones. One of them is the Hibernensis, which you can see on your right. I've just shown it here because it so clearly shows how a systematical collection is presented. So it's arranged thematically. In this case, this is a book on the truth, De Veritate, and then in chapters with constituent canons under these chapters. And the canons, which that's the most important part probably from these systematically arranged collections, is that these canons no longer are solely from the ecumenical councils or the papal letters. There's actually a larger variety of authoritative texts that can be mined for canons and that are mined for canons. Michael Elliott, in this same article, concludes then that the systematic collections disregard entirely the theoretical understanding of canon law as we see it in the historical collections, in favor of the utility of topical organization. In the hands of a systematic compiler, a complex hierarchy of auctoritates is flattened. A recent papal decretal is as good as a Nicene canon, a local synod as good as a penitential, as long as they both pertain to a certain topic. So you would think historically arranged collections are very much engaging with history, systematically arranged collections, not at all, at least that is what it seems. Now, with that in mind, let's have a look at a few of these systematic collections, and especially the oddballs, because they're the coolest, to see if that is true or if we actually do see signs and traces of this engagement with the past. Now, the first one that I want to look at is the Collectio Burgundiana, and here you have the image that I was looking for. That's the cover of Lotte Keary's book, and there's a reason why I project that here, because she has it under the name Collectio Burgundiana, and Maassen, which you can find underneath, also calls it. He calls it the Die Sammlung der Burgundische Handschrift. But what is important that they both call it a collection, because to be honest, if you look at the manuscript, you wonder if this is actually a collection or if this is just a mishmash of all kinds of texts. This is the contents. This is also how it's presented in the catalog of this particular manuscript. There's a lot of different texts. There's a penitential, and you can argue whether or not that's actually part of the collection. Then there's the scintillae or sparks from canons on the ordination of bishops, with a few canons only, and somebody has called that in itself a collection. So whether or not that's a collection in a collection, nobody knows. And then there's this whole list of authorities, as you can see here. The ones that I've highlighted are the ones that are copied in full. and the rest is all fragmentary, as you can see. So Lyon, for instance, the Council of Lyon only is present only with one canon, Mâcon with a few more, but not with the entire thing. So that makes it different from a historical collection. Hold on, let's see. Oh, this has changed. Yeah. Mordek, however, did once refer to the Burgundiana as a historical collection, but the scarcity of titles, because most of them are actually do not sport their own title, the fact that they're not copied in full, and the fact that the material is not presented in a chronological order actually argues against viewing this Collectio Burgundiana in some form of a historically structured canonical collection. What it does seem to be is something that is somewhere halfway between a historical collection and a systematical collection. And we see that when we actually look at the canons that are adopted, that are copied from these councils, because they have the their original numbering. So here we, for instance, see the Council of Clermont, which skips, if you can see it, from canon 12 to canon 14 on the right-hand side, and canon 13 is left out because of reasons. But there's no change made to the numbering. We can see something again here. So this is the opening of Agde on your left-hand side. On the actual recto side of the same folio, Clermont ended with 16. So the first one of Agde to be used is 12. You would expect perhaps to see the number 1 there, because it's the first one that from Agde that is actually copied, but we find a 12 there instead. Similar here, we find that in Agde from Council 28, it just skips to 32. So these are quite clear signs that the exemplar for this compiler was actually in a historical collection, which copied the canons in full with the normal numbering, and that here a compiler actually excised certain canons, but kept the old numbering. So we're sort of in a middle phase between a historical collection and a systematic collection. It seems that the compiler here chose the canons that he found useful, but didn't get to the stage in which he actually started rearranging them thematically. This halfway point is actually found in another collection as well. This is the collection in 400 chapters, like the Burgundiana, probably a late 8th century collection. And here we, and especially at the end, we'll get to the first part of the collection in 400 chapters later, but especially as the collection progresses, in the later chapters, we actually get to a stage where this seems to be also traces of a preparatory phase, a middle phase. So for instance, you can see here, these are chapters 120, 129, 130, 131, and 132. These are all canons from Gallic councils, and you can see that they are in chronological order, but obviously not copied in full. So again, it seems that the exemplar from which the compiler worked was a historical collection in which the Gallic councils were arranged chronologically, and he simply chose a few of these canons out of them. This is not to say that that there's no thematic, so that there's not already some signs of a thematic coherence here. So and I will let you know. But let's go into the content of the first 2 of these canons, because they're actually quite interesting. Because one way of engaging with history, as I said, is by omitting parts of it. So as we saw with the Liber ex Lega Moysi, obviously, where the historical references are left out, the same can be done with Gallic synods, and actually that is exactly what is happening here. this particular canon, chapter 129, which is canon 4 from the Synod of Valence from 374, is actually quite interesting. It is a very odd choice in a way. It concerns, and this particular Paris manuscript doesn't have the headings, but the headings in the heading for this particular chapter in the other manuscripts is concerning the crime of a true confession and of lying, which is rather odd. The canon actually states that bishops, priests, or deacons who say that they are stained by mortal sin should be degraded, even if that's not actually the case, since they either tell the truth and are guilty of the offense, or they're guilty of lying, which is an offense in itself. Now, that may seem like very logical, but it doesn't seem like a huge problem in the church that people, and especially clergy, go around about just confessing to all kinds of sins that they haven't committed. So there's a very clear historical context behind this canon, and you can find it if you actually start reading all the canons from the Synod of Valence. There's only 4 actually. And it seems to be that this is, no, it's actually quite clear that all of the canons are to be read in the context of a ordination of a particular priest, Acceptus, as the Bishop of Fréjus. And apparently he didn't want to become a bishop, so he made up a sin that he had committed in order to try to not become a bishop. Again, it can't have been something that happened all the time, but at this specific synod, they managed to, they at least wanted to decide on a few canons on this. So in all the other canons, so 1, 2, and 3, it's very clear, and Acceptus is actually mentioned. Synod 4, in canon 4 is actually the only canon in which Acceptus is not mentioned. So that's the one that they chose to include here. So again, here a compiler was very consciously working with history, that is actually getting rid of it. Chapter 130, so that's the next one, is from the Synod of Ries, and that has a similar strategy. So this 5th century synod was actually a response by Hilary of Arles to the uncanonical ordination of Bishop Armentarius. And this particular canon actually states that no one should go to a church that has lost its bishop unless a bishop from a neighboring church shall supervise the funerary periods. So obviously you can sort of deduce what happened here. Somebody was made bishop without Hilary of Arles actually ordering this. So again, in the entire synod, this particular bishop this Armentarius is mentioned in all of the canons except for this one, and so this one was actually adopted. It now, both of these actually have the appearance of a general, universal, if somewhat quirky, ecclesiastical rule. So they're taken out of their context, and now they are universal. And what they do anyway, they firmly establish the authority of the metropolitan. So that is one way in which you can say that compilers of systematic collections are very much engaging with the past, even though we don't find it in the collections, although we find the traces of them seriously looking at this and seriously making editorial decisions to adopt a canon or not. Now, there's also more sophisticated historical awareness, and that's also from the collection in 400 chapters. And this is at the beginning. So how the collection in 400 chapters works, it seems that the first 100 canons, 100 chapters are actually quite sophisticated, and this is exactly in the way that the compiler probably wanted to compose the entire collection. But as we sort of progress, he sort of loses some of his steam, and we get these, as I said, these clusters of canons that are obviously just taken from historical collections and kept in that order. In the beginning of the collection in 400 chapters, we actually find this communicated, this very sophisticated historical awareness of the compiler. There are two prefaces to the collection in 400 chapters, both of them in challenging Latin, or this was a scribe who was challenged by the Latin. And the first one is this, it's called a selection of synods. And here we see these are, if anyone should criticize the excerptor or criticize the writer and polisher, that's the opening statement. He who reads this shall understand, and then we get a whole list of authorities. We shall understand the Lord's conversation and the canons of the Holy Apostles, the 5 Holy Universal Synods, Nicaea, with 318 bishops, Sylvester of the Roman Church with 284, Constantinople, Chalcedon, Ephesus, and Syra, etc., etc., etc. Then we get to Arles, so we get to the Gallic Synods, Ries, here you get it, Orange, Valence, Orléans, and then the writings of the holy bishops of the city of Rome, and then ending with Augustine. So what we actually see here is a pretty much a chronological list of authorities. So even though the rest, or especially the following of this particular collection, is systematic and not chronological, the authorities, the main authorities that he's going to use are in fact chronologically arranged in this list. So there is a strong sense of history with the compiler. This Dominicum Sermocinationem, this is why I chose this particular folio, because those are the words there left. That's a bit mysterious, obviously, but I think in this context, we need to understand that as the Bible. So we have the Bible, the canons of the Holy Apostles, and then the 5 Holy Universal Synods. Because the biblical rules are, in fact, one of the central themes of the collection. In fact, the historical elements of these biblical rules is one of the central themes of this collection. There's another preface, as I said. This is the Praefatiuncula, which you can see in the middle of that folio, starts there. Here, it actually says with so many words, you can see in the gospel, that letter killeth, the spirit quickeneth, or likewise, the things that Moses proclaimed on death, the gospel proclaim on penance. So actually it says that the Old Testament is central to religious rules, but its precepts are recontextualized in the life-giving rules of the New Testament and later. Since Christ, there is a new covenant with God, and where the rules of Moses promised only death, the Gospels, through penance, promise life. And this duality of the Bible as a source of authoritative statements, as well as a record of the past, is very much preserved in these first roughly 100 chapters of the collection in 400 chapters. So here we read it. So one of these, one of the signs of this is, for instance, the continuous reference to Moses. So, for instance, in chapter 72, we just find the basically flippant. That's actually a passage from the Libellus Responsionem, but it's introduced as Moses prohibits and the Lord allows. But perhaps even more striking is a case in 2 cases, but one I shall explain. So the first one is chapter 59, but I'll look at the other one. This is chapter 80, where we find a canon or a rule taken from the Old Testament, and then a newer rule. It actually says in novo, and you can see that. I don't know if this probably doesn't work. You can actually see it on your right hand side, sort of in the middle of that of the image there, in novo, and that is a canon drawn from the penitential Theodore. So here we have someone who very clearly, you can see the historical element of this. So the Old Testament is well, as it says, old. And then there's the new element, which is here signified by Theodore. And you can see this is quite interesting because it actually does qualify the rule. So here it's about, we discussed this earlier, bestiality. The Old Testament says that whoever practices that dies with the animal, and Theodore actually says, well, there's actually a few years of penance. So this is exactly how the preface or the Préfaction said it. So where Moses proclaims death, which is exactly what he does here, the Gospels, or in this case, Theodore, give life, offer life. Oh, here, this is the end. In this way, and so these are the most striking elements, because actually we see these words in novo or novae canones, so twice. That is the way how Theodore is referred to. But actually, throughout these first chapters, we see that the law of the Old Testament was crowned and contextualized and nuanced by the New Covenant, the legal tradition of councils and synods, of papal decretals, but also of penitential instructions and the writings of the Church Fathers. So the collection in 400 chapters places the canonical present squarely within an alternative, canonical, and ultimately biblical reality, and its users and readers within an imagined community centered on the Bible. So in conclusion, contrary to Michael Elliott's quote, and I think a general opinion about this, the complex hierarchy of auctoritates as we find it in the historical collections is not necessarily flattened in the systematical canonical collections. In fact, in the process of selection, there is an active engagement with the past, even when it involves purging it from its historical context. But in the finished product, there is very often sophisticated engagement with the past. Here, the past, and especially old canons on pollution and purity, was sanitized not by purging it, but by confronting it with the translation of its fundamental principle in a truly new rule. That's it. Thank you.
Yes, please. This thing about the Sermo Conatio, it can just be the Sunday sermon, and I think that fits very well.
Yeah, that
Because
seems to.
I don't think that, I mean, the only other option would be the kind of the words of the Lord, I guess, as you interpreted it. But I think this is one weakness that we could eradicate from our scholarship, because I know where it comes from, but it doesn't make any sense. The
Right.
words conversation just so, but I think that in the context of understanding the canons and other, because I think it says the canons of the apostles, and then it's something about the synods. So yes, the Bible fits in there, but also an authoritative preacher fits in there quite well too.
Well, yeah, that's true, because the preface actually says he who reads this will be able to understand. So it doesn't actually say I've taken all my canons from these authorities, which he or she did, but that might not actually be the tenor or the meaning of that particular preface. So you might be right. The Bible in that case would be sort of oddly lacking, because especially the first 100. And actually more of the chapters actually use this Bible as a central, that's basically the basis.
It
So-
is first, I mean, so you could make that argument. that
Yeah, but it
has
could be, I
right
mean-
place. But so I just think either of these is probably preferable. to
Yeah.
What has previously been put forward. But it's your decision.
Well, no, I mean, either works, it doesn't really
But some of
matter
them
so
also,
much for
like,
the,
it's totally fine in medieval Latin to use that for sermon or preaching. I mean, some of Canadians.
yeah, no, exactly, no, that's absolutely, that's definitely an option, yeah.
Yeah, so I want to ask about historical, because we've been hearing a lot about it, right? And at this point, I'm starting to think that it's a little bit ambiguous or catch-all, right? So, what do you think about replacing historical with this approach that would look at this as, they're not necessarily engaging with the past, but with texts? And then this is an intertextual dialogue that they're having by selecting, by you know, within a frame of reference that's, you know, multi-layered with, you know, the Bible and the canons of the past, and then, you know, and then the deeper past, and you know what I mean? So
Yeah,
would it make it a richer approach, or, you know, does that make sense, or is it better to stick with the historical?
do you mean the term that we use for these collections, or do you mean
Yeah, like instead of saying that they're engaging with the past,
right.
what I'm suggesting
Yeah.
is that, you know, they're engaging with texts.
No,
and
yeah.
It's an intertextual dialogue that they're performing.
Yeah, and yes, that is, I think that's the basis, and that goes for every non-historical collection of canon law, basically, if it's really well structured like the Hibonenses, or if it's unstructured or derivative, that is exactly what is happening. What this particular collection actually does, it actually expresses this fact that there is an earlier covenant, there's an earlier relationship with divine truth that is superseded with this new rule, and it does that really systematically in the first, say, 100, well, a little bit less chapters. So we'll give you an Old Testament rule, and immediately, well, it starts with New Testament rules, but after a while it gives you an Old Testament rule, and then it gives you a penitential rule, or so. I mean, that doesn't,
Those
that's
are layers of text, that's what I'm saying.
yeah, but in a chronological order,
Right.
with the knowledge that there is a chronological progression in this. So it's not, and it's not that because that's interesting. For the Hibonensis, people have thought that you start with the highest authority, and then, you know, with authorities that are a little bit lower, and then that will work for the Bible as well. But here it seems to be a temporal primacy as well. So
Maybe you
this
can
is the
compromise
first.
by calling it salvation historical rather than historical.
I guess my point of departure is that, you know, I think that we can continue this conversation. Like,
Yeah,
there's so many other questions.
I don't want to restrict it as that is the only way that they're engaging with what they have in front, but because this is, well, it's sort of like an outlier in the way that it's so clearly referring to this difference in time as well.
Wolfram.
Thank you for the presentation. I would like to come back to this slide where you present the authorities, the name of the popes, and the canons. Can we go back to this one?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think there are two mistakes at least.
Oh, okay.
The Ephesus should come before Chalcedon.
Oh yeah. No, it's not entirely.
It's not, and
chronological.
also.
Yeah, no, that's annoying.
The Syracuse should come, well, not at the.
Yeah.
So
yeah,
it's not sort of striking, because the question is, how does this scribe know about history, and how might these mistakes have come about? Because Syracuse is quite important. I think he is credited with writing the very first decretal, and Christian Horn has written about it. So it's not just any pope. It's
Yeah.
one of, in this context, it is one of the important ones, and the important one is misplaced. So why? And also, Chalcedon is the fourth council, which might have been known to the scribe. So why are there mistakes in important matter? So it is a historical chronology really important? Is there anything behind this? What is history about this? Chronology.
Yeah.
Has it any importance?
No, that's it. No, that is a good point. So it's a sort of so it's first in categories, and then it's sort of
The first
roughly,
the first four ecumenical councils are quite important, and their orders sort of should be well known.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
it's confusing.
Yeah, no, exactly. Yeah, no, that's a good point. I'm not quite sure. So how that works. No, and this is not a very strong argument, especially in the Pefa Simple. You see in the Latin that the scribe is sort of out of his depth. So maybe he finds this a bit complicated, but that's not a very good argument. So I won't publish that. So I'm not exactly sure. So he's trying to sort of categorize it sort of roughly. But it's the same with the San Blasiana, which is actually very interesting and also a very good collection, but it's also not exactly in chronological order. So it's a historical collection, but not quite chronological.
And it says at the end, we uphold it according to the order of the highest priest. So what does he uphold? Is he upholding chronology or?
No, I think he upholds all the rules that these sources. Well, exactly, well, so this is my best translation of. Really.
Perhaps it's not chronological order, it's other order.
No, yeah. Yeah, secundum, what does it say? Can you see?
Where is it?
Very end. Maximus quos suscipiunt suscipimus secundum. Unionem. Yeah, I must admit that I chose Paris because it's my favorite copy. It's also the worst copy. So, linguistically, so I mean, I wasn't expecting us to do exegesis on this, but otherwise I would have chosen another manuscript.
Well,
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm also thinking with the criteria, not maybe of ordering, but of selection. So, and I can understand how these authors work. So the first thing is getting rid of everything which is too obviously historical.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, reading canons which are very much embedded in history, and they just don't make any sense when they leave them in the collection. And you mentioned it was in the Burgundiana, I think, that the entire all the canons of Gangra were copied.
Yeah.
Gangra are not really relevant. I mean, they're very much historical. It's a very specific situation.
No, I've been looking at this manuscript quite recently, and especially interested in this idea. Is this a collection? Is this the collection Burgundiana? Does it make any sense? And there is somewhere, so this is why I sort of highlighted the ones that are complete. There is, so I think it's about there. It's about before Gangra, where there seems to be not so much a difference in scribes, because there's a lot of scribal hands, but there's a difference in choir formation. So that's also, I mean, I need to look more into that, but it also seems like there's two different rationales behind these pieces of the
I was also thinking about this historical vision, and it refers to what Rick said. That it's both historical and intertextual, because they seem to be keen on mentioning all the important places of the councils. But for instance, when they mention, it's not here, it's probably in the 400 canons collection. So they mention Carthage, but only once, and there were several canons of Carthage. But it looks like they wanted to have it, Carthage at least once. The most important places in which the councils were held.
Yes, no, that it's true. This is it is an interesting and slightly mysterious preface, because there's a lot of Jerome in the collection, and he's not mentioned. So so the only church father is Augustine. So again, so if he's not listing exhaustively what he's actually using, he's trying to communicate something else.
But then still, the truth of the canons.
Yeah.
okay, final question, Jenny.
So thank you for the paper, and I found the undermining of these distinctions between the systematic and historical very useful. And I think you argued very convincingly that the assumption that the systematic flatten out of the authorities doesn't hold. But I wonder if you could say something then about the way in which authorities constructed in the systematic collections. Because I think if you've shown us that it's not flattened, it's more selective. But then is there sort of a particular advantage of that kind of approach in terms of shaping authority? Does it give you a little bit more flexibility? Does it allow the compiler to sort of substitute a logic of their own? I mean, just sort of, if you could sort of think a little bit about the different attitude towards construction of authority when you approach it in a less or in a more topical way.
Yeah. That's a good question. A question for an entire paper, basically. Well, it sort of touches on the discussion we had earlier, and I think the point of most of these systematic collections is the debate. So it's, and I'm convinced, but I mean, other scholars have said this as well or better than me, but I think it's the realization that behind every rule there is a divine principle, and it's just for us to find out what it is. So if you have two rules that nuance each other, or two rules that actually seem to contradict each other, there must be something that still binds them, and we might not know exactly what it is, but we'll have to find out. And sometimes just by putting them together, they nuance each other, or that. But the point is basically to express that there is a divine rule that we might not know, but it's but there is a truth that encompasses all.
Wonderful. So let us all thank Sven for the. And our final paper of the day will be given by Professor Daniela Heller, who is an associate professor at the Department of Middle East Studies at Ben Gurion University of the Negev, and the director of the Center for the Study of Conversion and Interreligious Encounters there. She was a 2021-2 fellow in Yaniv's group at the IIS, and her most recent book, published in 2020, was Sacred Place and Sacred Time in the Medieval Islamic Middle East. Her research interests include the history and historiography of the medieval Middle East, Islamic thought and practice, and comparative religion. And she's currently working on an ISF-funded project entitled Sacred Scriptures as Sacred Objects, the Material Quran in the Medieval Middle East. Daniela.
Thank you.
Okay. So, in contrast to many other papers today, my paper focuses on a medieval Muslim scholar hailed as the architect of Islamic fundamentalism, a man whose motto allegedly was, "All good is rooted in following the righteous first Muslims." كل الخير في اتباع السلف الصالح. That is a call for the return to the pristine golden, or in our terminology, sanitized age of the Prophet and the early Muslims. In their introduction to Making Sense of Islamic Fundamentalism, A Clash Within Islam, published in 2020, the two authors, Ward Horvitz and Eli Al-Sheikh, explained that the defining feature of fundamentalism is an unwillingness to compromise with the imperfect present, and the belief that by restoring the moral standards of an idealized past, believers can cleanse contemporary societies of corruption. The assumption is based on the conviction that the forefathers led a pure and ideal existence and should be taken as a model for future behavior. Bernard Heichel writes about contemporary fundamentalists known as Salafis, right? Salafis, Muslims, that the Salafi imagination reconstructs the early Muslims' sartorial, linguistic, cultural, and ethical habits and insists on being exactly like them. Likewise, writing about the Salaf in the Islamist imagination of today, Asma Afsauddin identifies 4 topics which are most ubiquitous in discourses about the admirable precedents set by those early Muslims: the establishment of the so-called Islamic State, the immutable nature of the Sharia, the Islamic law, the status and role of women, and the nature of jihad. Now, while contemporary Salafis may have a naive understanding of early Islamic history, which was actually fraught with disagreements, violent clashes, and painful civil wars, the late 13th century, early 14th century scholar I am talking about, Ibn Taymiyyah, was an exceptionally savvy and sophisticated thinker in all fields of religion. I don't think he was naive.
who was Ibn Taymiyyah. I'm not sure you all are familiar. So Ibn Taymiyyah was a theologian, a commentator on the Quran, a political thinker, and a jurist of the Hanbali school of law. I've added independent because, in contrast to most jurists of his age, Ibn Taymiyyah did not feel obliged to follow the school of law. He nominally belonged to the Hanbali school of law and took himself the liberty of addressing directly the sources, the Quran and the Hadith, rather than following previous scholars in his school of law. He was a mufti, which means that he gave legal decisions. He answered to many, many legal questions. And he was a madrasa professor, a teacher of Islamic law in Cairo and in Damascus. One of the reasons he's so admired today is that he was also a militant activist who dared confront both scholars and rulers of his age. He confronted the Mamluk rulers in whose state he lived, and Mongol rulers, rival theologians, prominent Sufi thinkers at the time when Islamic mysticism was very powerful, and received the patronage of the rulers and popular Sufi sheikhs, Shiites, especially vehemently, Jews and Christians, and he was also ready to pay the price, and he actually did. He was imprisoned several times. During his last imprisonment, his pen and paper were taken away from him. It was like the worst. It's described by his students as the worst painful suffering inflicted on him, and he indeed died at the course of this last imprisonment, unable to write. He campaigned against, he led many campaigns, and central campaigns were against the veneration of saints and tombs, which was widespread in his times, and also entrenched patterns of divorce and legal contracts. He was extremely controversial during his lifetime, and he actually is up to this day. To give an shed light on different perspectives on Ibn Taymiyyah, I've brought here a short excerpt of one of his biographers, Shams ad-Din al-Dhahabi, was an admirer of his actually, addressing the question whether Ibn Taymiyyah was actually a zealous conservative, as we would think of someone who his motto is to follow the Salaf, the first Muslims, or a daring reformer. So the assessment of this medieval colleague was, he supported the pure Sunnah, the way of the Prophet Muhammad, and the way of the pious ancestors, the Salaf, which he vindicated with unprecedented proofs, premises, and cases, using expressions which men of former and recent times refrained from and feared. He was so daring that a group of scholars from Egypt and Syria turned against him in an unprecedented way. They accused him of being an innovator, right? So conservative or an innovator. An assessment of a contemporary academic, Professor Yossi Rapaport of Queen Mary's College, claims a daring reformer with an exclamation mark. So in a very good book, I think, good collection of articles, which Rapaport has contributed to himself and edited, he writes the following. Ibn Taymiyyah's emphasis on the right of individual Muslims to engage directly with the sources of law has made him the adopted champion of the Salafi movement of the 19th and 20th century. However, to describe Ibn Taymiyyah's legal thought as Salafi in the sense of strict accordance with the practice of the first generations is to reduce his legal thought to only one of its components. For Ibn Taymiyyah, the reliance on the Salaf served to dislodge established legal authority. Emulating the ways of the first generations was not necessarily an aim in itself, in and of itself, lo lishma, to use a Hebrew expression, but often means of legitimating a challenge to the legal and theological orthodoxy of his time. So it goes, okay. So despite. Okay, so Rapoport concludes that Ibn Taymiyyah's Salafism was actually iconoclastic. As much as it was about idolizing the early Islamic community, it was about undermining the authority of later or of his contemporaneous scholars. By claiming loyalty to the Salaf, Ibn Taymiyyah exempt himself, as it were, from maintaining alliance to any contemporary theologian camp or juridical school, and justifies a stand that opposes that of most theologians and jurists of his age. I quite agree. And yet, I think that it is worthwhile to collect and reconstruct Ibn Taymiyyah's narratives about the Salaf from his enormous focus of writing, and identify the topics which were most ubiquitous in his discourse about the admirable precedents set by these early Muslims, and to try to explain why. And this is what I will do in the following 20 minutes. I will stress that this is a work in progress, and as I've said, the corpus is very large. Most of what I will present is based on this very big collection, 27 or 35 volumes in modern printed editions of Ibn Taymiyyah's fatwas, Ibn Taymiyyah's legal answers, which is actually a collection of most of his writing. It includes short answers to questions and full treatises, long, really full treatises that address questions of practice and religious practice and religious thought. He did not compile it himself. It was all compiled after his death. So we have a description of his students going into his home after his death in prison and finding, you know, the pages of pages and pages without any order. We're not sure if they did the best job in putting order into all this, but they compiled all those works into a collection known as Majmu'at al-Fatawa. So most of what I'm presenting is based on examples from this, but it is by no means exhaustive, and there's still a lot of work to be done. Let me stress that Ibn Taymiyyah had a very wide and rich arsenal of argumentation. And resorting to the Salaf, resorting to the first generations is only one. So I'd like to present his different types of reasoning. The examples I've given here in the square brackets pertain to his reasoning against tomb and saint veneration. As I've mentioned, this was one of his central campaigns. So Ibn Taymiyyah, and this is not necessarily in order of importance, but Ibn Taymiyyah uses theological reasoning, right? When he in the case of tomb and saint worship, he stresses, of course, the principle of divine unity, tawheed, and the prohibition on polytheism and the veneration of the created, the makhluk, rather than the creator. So this is like the basis of his whole campaign against saint worship and tomb worship. He uses logical reason or common sense based on the premises, which may be known from philosophers, which he very much opposed, by the way, that there's no contradiction between reason and revelation. If reason and revelation seem to contradict each other, we haven't done a good enough job of harmonizing the two. That's Ibn Taymiyyah's way. So in the case of tomb worship, saint worship, Ibn Taymiyyah turns to our common sense and tries to convince us that seeking intermediaries with God is absurd. If you're asking the intermediary, the saint or the prophet, to intercede for you to achieve something that is improper, why expect him to do so? If you want to achieve something that is proper, why do you need him? Turn to God, right? This is just, and likewise, he shows that the popular notion that supplication by a grave is more effective than supplication anywhere else is absurd, because God rewards the prayer rather than its place, etc., etc. Of course, he uses legal reasoning, I mean, agreed upon shari or maxims, and a hadith, the sayings of the prophet. In this case, two central sayings is do not make my tomb an idol that is worshipped, or do not make my tomb into a mosque. Yes, I'm returning to an issue that Robert has already raised today. And the principle, which he repeats many times, not to resemble, la tashabahu, polytheists, Jews, and Christians, or mukhalafat, il-mushrikin, wal-yahud, wal-nasara, being different. This is like a principle that he repeats in different contexts. Especially interesting, I think, is the way Ibn Taymiyyah incorporates historical argumentation or historical narratives, chunks of historiography into his reasoning, trying to convince us that, first of all, that many things are contextual. And I thought this is really striking, talking about the sacred land. Ibn Taymiyyah does not seem to think that the sanctity of land is an eternal trait or primordial trait. He says it depends on context. It depends on the historical period. So he said a land may be praised or venerated, or the opposite, at different times, depending on the status of its inhabitants. And that goes for Mecca too. When the polytheists lived in Mecca, it was not a sacred city. It became a sacred city when Muslims re-established monotheism in the town. Debbie, for your Byzantine Islamic border, Ibn Taymiyyah shows us that this frontier, which drew the most pious Muslims to the jihad and sort of sanctified the places where they inhabited, was constantly on the move. So there's nothing inherently sacred about the ribat or the throw,
The borderline.
frontier, because it depends. In one period it's really the frontier, and in the other it's in the main. It's in the heart. Okay, I'll skip the next example, but or maybe I'll summarize it. He shows us in the case again of saint worship and tomb worship that this improper practice, this terrible innovation, was actually brought by the Shiites. It was unknown before them. Yes, I'm looking at you. Yes. And since everyone knows that the Karmatis, the Fatimids, the Buwayhids were heretics, why follow practices that they had inserted into Islam only 200 years ago, right? So, and those are just two examples of, I think, quite convincing argumentation of Ibn Taymiyyah based on history and chronology. And finally, we come to the good example of the Salaf, Salaf al-Salih, the righteous first Muslims, sometimes entitled Madhab al-Salaf bil-Nuqul al-Mutawatira, the way of the first Muslims according to correct transmission, which may be qualifying a little bit like this big idea of following the Salaf, or qualifying it still further, the consensus of the Salaf, Ijma Salaf al-Ummah, the consensus of the Salaf and the greatest authorities. So perhaps we don't have this naive idea that all the Salaf were perfect, but if we phrase it in a more restricted way. So who are the Salaf according to Ibn Taymiyyah? Ibn Taymiyyah explains, and this is consensual today, that the Salaf include the first three generations of Muslims, the Sahaba, the companions of the Prophet, the Tabi'un, those who followed the Sahaba, and the Tabi'un, those who follow the followers of the Sahaba. Now, this amounts to almost 200 years, right? If we think of today, we think of a generation as 25 years, but according to the definition of a generation, the Sahaba includes people who were just born before the death of the Prophet and supposedly had some contact with him. So we're speaking of almost 200 years, of a very long period of time into the Abbasid period. Ibn Taymiyyah claims that there is no religious issue they had not dealt with, and in all the sciences of religion, their opinions were most correct. It doesn't say perfect, but most correct and better, and their errors or lapses were smaller than those of later generations. He says also that the belief and practice, right? Belief and practice of the Salaf were more perfect and correct, and their errors minor. Following the righteous Salaf includes matters of doctrine, law, manners, and morals. This is how one follows them. What does he say? Now, as I promised, I'm trying to pinpoint what does he say about the Salaf. So the Salaf had, he repeats that in various ways, superior understanding of the Quran, thanks to their intimacy with the Prophet. They had actually, especially the first generation, witnessed the revelation and heard the Quran from the Prophet. So their understanding of the Quran surpasses most of that of later authorities, just as their knowledge of the ways and attitudes of the Prophet was beyond that of later generations, for they saw the Prophet and witnessed the revelation of the Quran. He says, if we cannot find exegesis in the Quran itself or in the Sunnah, we should go back to the sayings of the companions, right? So they are the best complementary source to the Quran itself. He is more specific about the exegesis, the ways of the exegesis the Salaf were doing. He says they refrained from allegorical interpretation of the Quran, and this is one of the great, one of the very polemical issues between Ibn Taymiyyah and his theological opponents, whether one may use allegorical interpretation, especially the thorny issue of describing God and anthropomorphic verses of the Quran. So Ibn Taymiyyah is totally opposed to allegorical interpretation, and he claims this is based on the Salaf who refrained from it. They also refrained from changing the meaning of Arabic words, which is also thinks is deplorable, by switching the order of letters, like reading instead of istawla al-arsh, settled on the throne, istawa al-arsh, which means like established his authority, referring to a well-known or several well-known verses of the Quran speaking about God sitting or establishing himself on the throne. Another a specific issue which seems to have been very important for him is claiming that the Salaf adhered to the right calendar. They did not celebrate any holidays which were not prescribed by the Sharia, such as the night said to be the night of the birth of the Prophet, note that, in the month of Rabiul Awal, or some of the nights of Rajab and the first Friday of the month. Rajab is the 7th month of the Muslim calendar. Half of my book pertains to its the construction of its sanctity. I will not go into it, but there was a whole issue about special prayers and special practices that were quite current in his times during specific nights of this month and days of this month, and Ibn Taymiyyah is totally against, and he claims this was not done in the time of the Salaf. The 18th of Dhul Hijjah, the date the Shi'is celebrate the alleged nomination of Ali by the Prophet Muhammad, or Shawwal 8, which is a day which is especially pious, and an extra week of fasting after Ramadan. All these are innovations that the Salaf had never practiced or rejected. He stresses that the Salaf did not celebrate the birthday of the Prophet, which is a big celebration in his day, despite the fact that it was not forbidden. Right? But he says, if they didn't do it, all the more so we shouldn't do it. They were so close to the Prophet and they loved him so much. They did not celebrate non-Muslim or infidel festivals. The ceremonies undertaken, this is another quote, by many people Memon's translation, many people during winter on 24th December, which they claim to be the birthday of Jesus, fall under the same heading. Kindling fires, preparing foods, lighting candles. In short, all practices of this day are disreputable. Making a festival out of this birthday is a Christian cult and has no basis in Islamic faith. Absolutely no mention of it is found in the age of the Salaf. Its origin is rather borrowed from the Christians. And he explains nicely, sorry, maybe I'll go back to that because he explains that it's Christian, but it has
Practical.
yeah, or sort of like, I mean, I think he alludes to this, the pagan context of Christmas in winter time. 5 minutes, okay. So, as I've said before, he uses all his arsenal in his attack on the worship of tombs and sacred places, but amongst others, also referring to the Salaf. So he says the rightly guided caliphs and companions of the Prophet did not travel to the tombs of great prophets such as Abraham in Hebron, not far from here, or to the tombs of other righteous men, nor to Mount Sinai, where God has spoken to Moses, nor to the rock in Jerusalem. This is not often mentioned today by Muslims, right? But Ibn Taymiyyah was quite against the Muslim veneration of Jerusalem, nor to the rock in Jerusalem, the rock of Qubat al-Safa. For Muslims, it is merely an abrogated direction of prayer, right? It doesn't make much of Qibla Mansukh. They did not go to visit the tomb of the Prophet to seek his intervention. And here Ibn Taymiyyah tells a nice story about a severe drought in the time of the second caliph, Umar ibn al-Khattab. And as proper, Umar ibn al-Khattab called upon a special prayer for rain, Salat al-Istiqam. And says Ibn Taymiyyah, nobody thought of going to the tomb of the Prophet and asking for rain, right? They performed the prayer, but not by the tomb of the Prophet. So, and and another story about Umar ibn al-Khattab, who conquered the city of Tusta, where the prophet Daniel was known to be buried and is venerated. And Umar ibn al-Khattab concealed the grave of the prophet Daniel totally, so that no one can continue, won't be able to find the place and continue to worship the tomb. He did this by digging 12 ditches and then covering them all up. And again, when he visited Jerusalem, he did not go to the rock. Another issue is the treatment of non-Muslims. Ibn Taymiyyah claims that the Rashidun had the first caliphs, the first Muslims, treated non-Muslims correctly. They were appropriately relentless towards the sale of wine, for example. They had regarding fighting against monks and taking jizya, taking the special tax from them during the great conquests. They did the right thing. They ordered not to spare them. And regarding the proper way of collecting this tax, Umar ibn al-Khattab said, humiliate them, but do not exploit them. So, preliminary results of this this little study are that Ibn Taymiyyah, talking about the pristine, golden or sanitized perhaps age of the Salaf, is not naive, but stresses and still thinks that those are the authorities to follow. He stresses their knowledge of the Quran based on their intimacy with the Prophet. He stresses two major issues, I think. One is their keeping proper distance from from un-Islamic or non-Muslim practices. Regarding the calendar, the festivals, and also keeping the non-Muslim in their places. And I think that those two topics had bothered Ibn Taymiyyah almost obsessively during his lifetime. And in this, I think, has pretty much to do with the context of his own times. Ibn Taymiyyah lived in a time of an influx of converts into Islam, converts which were suspected, perhaps rightly so, of not being fully converted into Islam and bringing with them their Christian heritage and Christian holidays and un-Islamic practices, and being not loyal enough to Islam in a time in which the Muslim or the Mamluk state confronted the Crusaders, or just finished during his time, still confronted the Crusaders and confronted the Mongols. Thank you.
Any,
Yes, thanks for that. I was wondering whether you could maybe just do a little more to contextualize the hyper literalism that he expresses. Does this go against the exegetical methodology that is prevalent in this age, or does it go against popular practices? It's like you couldn't really figure out which. And is it really hyper literalism, or does it suggest an alternative methodology of exegesis? Because otherwise it just seems completely ahistorical to expect that someone could live like that 600 years after the fact.
Live like what? I'm not sure.
Live like a Salaf.
No, I don't think he, okay, the literalism is typical of the Hanbali school of law. The Hanbali school of law from the 9th century is very much opposed to allegorical interpretation of the Quran. And
Are they working on the basis of some definition of allegory?
definition of allegory, they claim, or they proclaim to be faithful to the word of the law, to the word of scriptures, and they would always prefer a Quranic verse or a hadith to the interpretation based on allegory or qiyas, which is analogy, exactly. Analogy and allegory, and this goes for allegory, especially goes for theology. So theology and analogy goes for legal. And what I'm saying is, actually, what I think I tried to say is that Ibn Taymiyyah does not have this image of the sartorial, the linguistic, like everything. He has this idea fix of how life was in the times of the Prophet, and he says, let's do the same. He uses this idea of the correct ways of the Salaf to stress certain points which he wants to make.
In order to undermine other exegetical approaches or popular customs?
Very much against popular custom, yes, very much against popular custom, and also against other scholarly interpretations. In his polemics against, by the way, arguing against the veneration of saints, he polemicizes with other scholars as well.
Because I would imagine that appeal to the Salaf would have been a prevalent exegetical technique of other scholars working during his time, or was he unique in this?
He was definitely not unique, but no, he's definitely not unique. He is uniquely known as the forefather or the architect of Salafi movements of today. But I think that it's not. First of all, I think that in his legal reasoning is, and maybe others who are knowledgeable of Islamic law can chip in, that it's unusually rich in taking from, as I've tried to show, and he definitely stresses this, amongst others, the importance of following the Salaf and trying to prove that they were the most faithful to the prophet. And both in their understanding of the Quran, in their practice, and in their belief.
From. Yeah, thank you for your talk. Was he the first Jew, the third generation, the Tabi'un and Tabi'in, in this concept of a Salaf, or were there others to include a third generation among the very first Muslims?
I don't think he's first.
He's not first.
I don't think so, but I'm not, I cannot cite such a definition
But-
from an earlier scholar.
But, well, be it as it may, he must have known, of course, that the Shiites refer to Ali, and the first Shiites must have been members of the first 2 or 3 generations. So there
Oh,
must have
That's
been
why he
division.
qualifies it. That's why he says the righteous one.
So that
There's-
was not,
you-
so that it's clear that there's no unanimous consensus
Oh,
with the very
no.
first. So can he, why can he claim that there was a consensus?
He does not claim that there
Does
was
not.
something. No, during those years, first of all, Islam changes immensely from what it began, right from its beginnings in Mecca and Medina to Baghdad and we're up to Harun al-Rashid. We're up to this caliph,
Yeah.
you know, after the translations, after the Shiite split, after Islam has changed, after the construction of an empire. No, so he does not claim that there was unanimity or consensus within the Muslims. There were all the heresies you want, you know, where it sprang up during that period. And that's why he actually, you know, he talks about going after the Salaf, but he qualifies it with the Salaf, the correct, the consensus of
The righteous
of the righteous ones, exactly. So I think he is careful enough not to paint, as I said, not to paint this ideal golden age that some naive Muslims may be imagining. He's well aware that this is a time of fierce disagreement within the Muslim community.
So you mentioned a few examples referring to Umar ibn al-Khattab.
Yes.
Would he mention also Ali as one of the examples? The fourth of the Rashidun Caliph. So because he's
yes.
By this point, there were 4 Rashidun.
Right.
so there is,
They
it's
They
not
weren't
a-
originally, but by this.
it's not a problem to refer to Ali.
No, he refers to Ali,
Central
if I remember,
Yeah.
if I remember correctly, what I brought here is, refers to Ali is treating right the non-Muslims. Yes, he would definitely refer to Ali.
So there's the strategy with Ali I mean, it's a huge problem, right? For all Sunnis, the fact that the 3rd and the 4th caliphs fight each other is hugely problematic. And so no one quite solves it. But what they do with Ali is they say he had bad followers who were like Persians and Jews and that sort of thing, who led them astray and perverted and confused the community. So that's the.
And also they select which bits of Ali's legacy they
Yeah.
want to
Yeah.
hold as truly Ali's legacy. And then there's a lot of, in their view, there's a lot of fabricated stuff which the Shiites say about Ali, which is just not part of Ali's legacy. So, you know, the traditional Sunni and the Ibn Taymiyyah is not negative about Ali, but he does recognize that his figure has been hijacked by the Shiites and made into someone that he wasn't, and which he would never have recognized himself. You know, it's like, and so the commitment to the doctrine of the 4 Rashidun is like central to Sunni identity by this point, and Ibn Taymiyyah is not going to undermine that.
Right.
Well, I've never seen any text in which he undermines it.
No, but regarding fabrication, as you
Yeah.
said, one of the excerpts I brought, I didn't fully read it. He accuses the Shiites of fabricating a lot of hadith, and having ruled Egypt for 200 years, those lies have become entrenched. It says Ibn Taymiyyah, it's really interesting. And even when the Fatimid dynasties who ruled Egypt for 200 years, and then even when Saladin, the champion of Sunni Islam, comes in and his descendants rule after his family rules after him, they cannot uproot what 200 years of Shi'i rule had caused people to believe.
Okay, Robert.
There's one question before mine.
Mark, I think concerning place and space, he spoke about borders and holy places. He speaks like one of the sages, exactly like one of the sages. At least is the way that I see them. They spoke about, and they speak about it tomorrow, they spoke about dynamic borders. And I think that it's common between the sages, not only the Maimonides, also in the Mishnah and Talmud. That there's no any prayer in holy places is not allowed in any graves. Except the graves of the tombs of the patriarchs in the world. It's exception. But the other graves are not allowed in prayer.
And still, it was a very, very common practice.
And I
because
think
most
if
scholars
someone
did
spoke
not
about it,
post
I
reason.
think that as well as the rabbis, they had a polemic against popular custom, also here, polemic against popular custom of praying in graves and tombs.
Yeah, that, absolutely.
I'm thinking about what you said without using the word about innovation. We had already more explicit in Debbie's paper. So the old is good, the new is healthy, and we obviously we can see that the same kind of argumentation in Christianity from late antiquity to the Reformation, or even later. But in Christianity, it is, I mean, the argument is used by both sides. So sometimes it's quite challenging. I mean, how to say that the cult of saints was there at the very beginning, but they say, well, no, you don't understand. It was there, but well, implicit, not explicit, or you misread the text, or you ignored the text, or something like that. And I wonder, but in these cases, I'm thinking about both your papers. So whether the opponents were able to strike back and use the same argument against you and say, no, actually, this is not innovation. So it was there from the very beginning.
Regarding the station of tombs, you can quote the prophet saying that it's okay. You can quote.
But they did it.
Portraying the prophet, because the hadith is testimony not only to what the prophet said, but also to what the prophet allegedly did. The prophet going to his mother and etc. So yeah, you can reason that something is an innovation or actually has been there from the very beginning.
Yeah, the argument depends on hadith. Well, Sunnism is based on hadith. So it's always going to be a question of who has more and better hadith than the other guy. That's what it was.
Very interesting presentation, thank you. So the way you paint Ibn Taymiyyah as a real sort of anti-traditionalist, right? He's uprooting tradition, embodied tradition that's passed down from his most recent forefathers, and he's replacing it with textual authority texts from the distant past. But the texts are themselves passed down by recent forefathers, right? So does he have a place that you've seen where he acknowledges embodied authority as perhaps as an embodiment of the Salaf, so we can see the practice of the Salaf in embodied authorities of our time? Or is there any position for traditionalism in the sense of, yes, I'm following my teacher, I'm following my father?
Even
He's going back to the last generations he's going back to al-Hadith, and I think that's also why it goes into the time of al-Hadith, and really the last of al-Hadith was Ahmed bin Hanbal.
Right.
He's essentially, his position's very, very similar to theirs. He's actually hearkening back not to the generation of the Prophet of the Sahaba, he's hearkening back to Zuhri, Ibn al-Mubarak, like these guys of that transition period into Proto-Sunnism, which is I think
Yeah,
interesting.
the eponymous founder of the Hanbali School of Law, definitely. And which other NATO authorities?
It's
And he doesn't say,
It's-
my teacher was my teacher was the,
Trying to remember.
a good.
Who this site, and I'm not
Yeah.
sure.
So he would have had actually the great example of Ibn Hanbal himself, who said, you know, don't take human precedent, only the Quran and the Sunnah. And that's exactly what he's saying that they have to do.
I think Ibn Taymiyyah believes that he's actually following Ibn Hanbal as opposed to the Hanbali school, which has made.
And he's right.
Which has made a tradition out of it.
Yeah.
Whereas he believes he's actually following Ibn Hanbal, and he says,
Don't follow
But
human.
there's this critical word called taqleed, which is like
Yes.
following of a teacher or a school without actually knowing the reason why you're following that school. It's like, you know, it's a submission of your own legal or rational purposes to, or capabilities. And just saying, I'm just gonna follow what the school says. And he's dead against that. And
Yeah,
he believed Ibn Hanbal was dead against that. So he's being a proper Hanbali. Whereas all of these other Hanbalis, they all follow what the last teacher of the Hanbali school said and the teachers before that and teachers. They're not proper Hanbalis. Because if you're
Yeah,
a
but
proper Hanbali, then you
Yep.
rip up the whole school and you just do your own investigation into what the Salaf thought or did, and you follow that.
Right, and he doesn't feel obliged to prefer a Hanbali authority over a Shafi'i. He doesn't feel restricted by school of law.
Unfortunately, we are going to have to end here. Fun as this discussion is, and much as we can continue it, let us all thank Daniela for